Hey guys, tonight we'll step through the cold mist of time together to a place where winter wasn't just a season, but a fight for survival. Imagine yourself standing inside a European castle of the Middle Ages, where the wind howls through cracks in the stone, torchlight flickers across damp walls, and knights once warriors of glory now battle their most silent enemy, the cold. If you love journeys like this where history is told through feeling, through breath and flame, then please hit that subscribe button. Every subscription is like a small torch, helping me keep these stories alive for you. Now, find yourself a cozy spot, dim the lights, pull up a warm blanket, and let your imagination lead the way. Tonight, we begin deep within a snow-covered castle. In the middle of a long hallway, torchlight flickers against cold grey stone walls. Each flame seems to struggle for life as the wind sneaks through the cracks of the old castle. The weak yellow light sweeps across every fissure, every patch of wet moss, before fading into the endless dark. You hunch your shoulders, pulling your cloak tighter, but the cold still seeps into your skin as if the thick walls don't just keep out the wind, but also hold within them centuries of chill that never melted away. Your footsteps echo softly, clop, clop, on the uneven stone floor. The sound travels far, bouncing back from every side, making it seem like someone else is walking beside you. A small mouse darts across and disappears behind a pile of damp straw. The air is thick with the smell of smoke, mould, and the faint scent of singed wool from the hearth in the next room. The castle at night isn't like in paintings. It's not grand, not glowing like the ones in fairy tales. It's a massive stone machine, heavy, breathing cold. The wind slips through the arrow slits, howling like distant cries. Even the thick wooden doors tremble with every gust. And you realize, no matter how thick the walls, the cold always wins. It crawls through cracks in the wood, slides into your sleeves, creeps down your collar, and settles deep in your bones. Outside, snow falls thick and steady. Flakes cling to the window frame, then melt into icy droplets that slide down the stone grooves. You look out and see a sky without stars, only the silvery grey of wind and mist. Somewhere in the courtyard, a horse snorts, a long hoarse sound. They too are shivering, seeking warmth in the damp stables, where servants pile straw through the night just to keep the war horses alive. You walk past the great hall, once the heart of everything by day. Now, it's just an empty cavern. In the centre, the fire in the grand hearth burns weakly, only embers glowing faint red. On the walls, thick tapestries hang heavy with damp, still wet to the touch. The floor is covered with straw and dry grass laid down to absorb moisture, now mouldy and giving off that musty scent of winter trapped inside. In the corner, a night guard sits by the fire, head bowed, his armor hanging silently on its stand. You hear the faint clink of metal whenever the wind slips through, like the sigh of steel after a day of battle. Everything here has its own sound, the sound of isolation, of walls that never sleep. You turn into a spiral staircase. The railing is so cold it's coated with a thin layer of frost. Each step echoes upward, making you feel like the castle itself is swallowing you whole. Upstairs, the corridor narrows. Slivers of light escape from nearby rooms, where oil lamps burn weakly, their smoke forming thin ribbons in the air. You touch the wall rough, wet, and cold like living ice. In a knight's chamber, you see a low wooden bed covered with a dark wool blanket. At its foot sits a small chest holding cloaks, gloves, and personal trinkets. On the table, a cup of wine shimmers faintly, its surface frozen along the rim. In the corner, a small vent lets out smoke from the hearth, though most of it lingers in the air, making you cough softly and blink through the sting. You understand now why people once called this a luxurious, cold prison. Because even in a castle, even among nobles, it's hardly warmer than a cave in the woods. The only difference is thicker walls and slightly brighter torches. A thought slips into your mind. Wealth back then meant freezing in grandeur. The common folk outside live in tiny huts, huddled together around a fire, hearing the wind howl but staying warm because they have each other. Inside the castle, a knight has his own bed, fur, wine, and candles, but no human warmth. Only the wind keeps him company. You walk toward the window, placing your hand on the thick, rough glass. Outside, snow drifts gently, each flake glittering under the moonlight. Your face reflects faintly on the cold surface, then vanishes beneath the fog of your own breath. In that moment, you realize the only warmth in this room comes from you. Far away, a bell tolls from the watchtower, deep, heavy, and slow. Each ring marks another hour of the endless cold night. You imagine the guards on the battlements, hands trembling around their torches, eyes squinting against the gusts. They don't sleep, they stand watch not just over the castle, but over the faint flame of humanity surviving through eternal winter. You return to the small room and sit on the edge of the bed. The stone floor beneath your feet feels like ice, numbing your toes. From the ceiling, water drips steadily, plop, plop. Each drop a reminder that this winter still has a long way to go. You inhale deeply, catching the mix of damp, smoke, wool, and straw. A strange scent, unpleasant yet familiar. The scent of the Middle Ages, the scent of survival. And then, as you look around, you begin to see the beauty in this cold. Not the beauty of splendor, but of endurance. Every small flame in the room, no matter how faint, is a tiny victory of humanity against nature. Every visible breath, a proof that you are still alive. Outside, snow covers the stone walls. Inside, you pull the blanket closer, your hand brushing against the rough wool, hearing the soft rustle of fabric against your skin. The cold is still there, but now, you understand. In this castle, people never wished for warmth to come. They simply learned to live with it. You close your eyes. The wind outside no longer feels menacing. It's like the breath of time itself, drifting through the stones, whispering the stories of those who once shivered here centuries ago. And tonight, you too become part of that story, a wanderer lost in winter, learning to listen to the cold instead of fearing it. Have you ever wondered who those meter-thick walls were really built for? For the people living inside or for the fear outside? A medieval castle, from afar, looks magnificent. Spires stabbing the sky, flags fluttering in the wind, walls standing strong like a declaration of power. But once you step inside, you'll see a truth colder than the frost outside. It wasn't made for comfort. It was made for survival. Those walls are armor, not blankets. They were built to stop arrows, stones, and enemies, but no one thought to stop the wind. Look around you. Every stone was laid by hand, held together by rough mortar, without a single layer of insulation. When winter came, the cold seeped into every crack, clung to every block, spreading like the castle's own breath. The very walls built to protect people now betrayed them, trapping the chill like a massive ice vault. If you place your hand on the wall, you'll feel it's colder than the air itself. It drinks the warmth right out of your palm, as if alive, as if hungry. Human heat becomes food for stone. The more people inside, the more warmth gets devoured, until only silence remains. Why is it like that? Because castles were born from war, not peace. Every design was made to repel invaders, not to comfort those within. The thicker the wall, the harder to break, but the colder it became. The smaller the windows, the safer from arrows, but the less light, the less warmth. The longer the hallways, the better to slow attackers. But every draught of wind turned into a miniature storm, slicing through the bodies of night guards. A castle is a fortress, and in a fortress, safety always walks hand in hand with cold. People of that time knew it well. Records tell that when winter came, nobles would leave their stone keeps for manor houses, smaller, warmer homes down in the lowlands. Only when danger loomed did they return behind those thick, frozen walls. You see, even the owners didn't want to live in their castles for long. It wasn't a palace, it was a giant shield. But that shield came with a cost. Inside, every sound echoes, the air is damp, and the walls weep when the frost deepens. Summer is stifling, winter unbearable. Every time you breathe and see your own mist, it clings to the wall as a thin layer of frost. By morning it's turned to ice. Archaeologists once measured the temperature inside ancient stone chambers in England and France. During winter, the room stayed around 37 to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, almost the same as outside. In deeper levels, where the walls are thickest, it's even colder, because stone holds the chill longer than snow. The people inside were never truly warm. They were only less cold than death. Ironic, isn't it? The most powerful were often the coldest. While peasants huddled by the fire in wooden huts, sharing warmth from family and flame, the lords of the land lay alone behind stone walls, wrapped in furs, listening to the wind whisper like the castle's own spirit. Imagine, as night falls, the wind slipping through arrow slits, snuffing out the candle on a table. The light vanishes. Everything sinks into darkness and frost. Only the faint crackle of a dying fire remains, and the wind circles like the ghosts of centuries past. Sometimes, people hung thick tapestries on the walls to block the drafts, or added wooden panels as insulation. But it was like patching a tear in a giant made of ice. The more you try to fight it, the more you realize stone cannot be tamed. It remembers the cold of every winter before, and gives it back to you each night. Many old castles still carry traces of that chill. Moss growing in bedchambers, damp ceilings, walls darkened by centuries of condensation. They say castles are alive, but they're cold-blooded creatures. They have no heart, no warm breath. They exist to protect, not to comfort, and maybe that's where their strange beauty lies. When you walk through a freezing great hall, staring up at the smoke-blackened beams, you see both the power of humankind to command nature and their limits. They could build high walls, deep moats, towering keeps, but they could never stop the wind. They could forge sharp swords and heavy armor, but still shiver when winter came. The cold in the castle isn't just physical, it's a metaphor for life in those times, harsh, disciplined, with no room for softness. A knight learned to endure cold the way he learned to endure wounds. A noble learned to sit upright even when his hands trembled. A servant learned to bow before the fire, taking in whatever little warmth remained after his master. And in that chill, something else happened. The cold brought people closer. It made them gather around the fire, made servants and masters part of the same fate. Humans surrounded by stone, hoping together for a morning that wasn't freezing. That's the paradox of the medieval castle. A monument built to show human strength, but one that revealed, more than anything, human fragility before nature. So when you hear the wind whistling through the walls tonight, don't think only of the cold. Think of history breathing around you. Those stones have seen hundreds of winters, heard swords clash, prayers whispered, and the sighs of souls who knew they were safe but never warm. You look up at the ramparts, see slivers of torchlight glimmering across the stone like veins through a giant body. And in that moment, you understand. Castles weren't built for people to live comfortably. They were built so people could live at all. You might think that power and wealth mean warmth, that those at the top of society, living in towering castles, must be surrounded by roaring fires and soft velvet. But tonight, as you sit in this cold stone room, you realize the truth is the complete opposite. Outside, in the small wooden huts nestled at the foot of the hill, the common folk are gathered around their fires. Their homes are simple thin walls, straw roofs, smoke drifting lazily above. But inside those low rooms, the warmth spreads evenly, wrapping everyone like a giant blanket. They sit close together around the fire, sharing seats, sharing stories, sharing their breath. Meanwhile, where you are, a noble's chamber feels like an icy prison wearing a crown. Thick walls, high ceilings, narrow windows, everything built to fend off enemies, not to hold heat. The fire in the hearth burns bright, but only your face feels its touch, while behind you the cold lurks like a living shadow. The chill of stone seeps through layers of wool, through cloaks, through furs, and settles deep into your skin. People say the poor suffer more, but in winter, they're far warmer than you. They have fire, people, laughter. You have walls, wealth, power, and loneliness. Listen. Outside, the wind whistles through cracks in the door, slamming against stone edges. Below, in the peasants' homes, children laugh, firewood pops and crackles. On one side, life, on the other, proud silence. In this freezing air, pride becomes chains, binding people to ice. Outside, peasants gather around a pot of boiling soup. They inhale smoke, cough, then laugh. One tells a story, another plays a fiddle, the soft sound of strings rising warm and simple. Inside the castle, the noble's dinner takes place in silence. Red wine fills silver cups, bread lies cold on tin plates. The great hall, vast and echoing, is lit by a few trembling torches. Every breath turns to mist before their faces. They speak polite words, but lips tremble, voices crack. An old knight bends toward a small candle, his hand stiff as stone. No one laughs, no one speaks loudly. The clink of knives on plates sounds like the wind tapping on bones. You look around and see pale faces glowing in the firelight. This is the image of luxury, frozen luxury. Outside, peasants sleep on straw, under thick blankets, pressed close together. They breathe in smoke, hay, and the scent of skin all blending into a primal warmth. But here, in a grand bed draped in silk, your sheets feel as cold as metal. The heavy wool blanket can't hold the heat. You can summon servants to bring more wood, more wine, but no one can summon human warmth. Sometimes nobles look down from their windows, seeing the flicker of fires below, hearing faint songs in the night, and feel a strange kind of longing. One gentleman once wrote in his diary, "I have everything, except warmth." It wasn't just physical cold, it was the cold of loneliness, of separation, of a life protected by walls but stripped of humanity's breath. Perhaps, on long nights, they too wished to sit under a low straw roof, listening to crackling wood instead of leaning against frozen stone. You think about it, how strange it is. The castle, with all its pride, can't protect a person from the simplest thing, the weather. No wall is thick enough to stop the wind. No amount of riches can buy true warmth. In fact, wealth makes people colder, because it widens the space between hearts. In the wide, noble chambers, one person sleeps alone on a vast bed, while outside, dozens sleep pressed together, their breath forming a shared flame. Here, everyone burns their own candle, and when it goes out, darkness swallows the whole castle. You imagine, when night deepens, the fire dies, the smoke clears, and only the wind remains. You lie there, under heavy blankets, staring up at the tall wooden ceiling, and suddenly feel small. Everything you own, gold, jewels, power, can't warm a single night. Outside the window, snow falls. Below, the poor still sing, still hold each other close. Maybe deep down, warmth isn't found in fire or blankets, but in closeness. You realize that the cost of status isn't just responsibility, it's distance. The higher you rise, the colder it gets. The richer you are, the farther you drift from the fire. Poverty, it turns out, still holds what every castle lacks: the warmth of human connection. You sit up, reaching toward the small candle. The flame trembles, but it's alive. Maybe in this frozen world, even a tiny light like that is enough to remind you that not everything has turned to ice. Whether you're a knight or a peasant, the night is just as long. And when the wind howls through the cracks in the wall, you understand the only ones truly warm are those who have someone beside them. Night has completely fallen over the castle. Outside, snow covers the courtyard, and the cold silver moonlight glows on the wet stone walls, making them shimmer faintly like the skin of a sleeping giant. You lie in that darkness, not quite asleep, not quite awake. And then, you begin to hear what daytime always hides: the music of the medieval night, where every sound carries its own spirit, breathing cold air through every corner of the fortress. First comes the wind. It doesn't just blow outside, it slips through the walls, whistling between the thick stones. Sometimes it howls long, like someone calling your name from far away. Other times, it breaks into ragged, uneven breaths. You hear it scrape against flags, wood, and iron doors, each sound different. Metal clinks, wood groans, and sometimes a bolt slams shut like an invisible hand knocking. The wind is never steady. It comes and goes, repeating itself, like an old ghost wandering the halls, unable to rest. You stay still, feeling the chill of the draft sneak through the bed curtains and brush against your neck, like an icy fingertip. The wind here is not like country wind. It carries the echo of stone and the loneliness of centuries without warmth. Then comes the sound of water. Somewhere in the ceiling, inside the stone veins, droplets fall steadily, drip, drip. Each drop counts time, slow, cold, indifferent. They say that on long winter nights, if you listen to dripping water long enough, you'll start to feel as if someone's whispering behind you. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's the stone itself speaking, telling stories of winters past, when others once lay here as you do now, listening, shivering, waiting for morning. The damp scent spreads with each drop, mixing with smoke from the hearth and the burnt wool smell, forming the castle's signature aroma, sharp, musty, and ancient. In that pause between sounds, the mice begin to sing their part. Not one, but many, scurrying through wooden gaps, running along the walls, their tiny claws tapping softly like a gentle rain on tiles. They are the real inhabitants here, small creatures that winter never slows. They rummage through chests, nibble on crumbs, drag straw to build nests right beneath your bed. You open your eyes in the dark, and can almost imagine their little black eyes glinting in the dying embers. To medieval people, mice were both pests and companions. They lived with humans, ate from the same stores, and froze through the same nights. Sometimes, a servant would wake and toss a shoe to chase them away, only to laugh, knowing that in this cold, at least something else was still alive. When the wind, the water, and the mice blend together, the castle becomes a giant instrument. Every stone, every doorframe, every hallway vibrates in its own tone. From afar, you hear chains clinking softly against armor, clang, clang, like a lonely bell ringing in the wind. Down in the cellar, firewood crackles faintly. Upstairs, a door creaks open, maybe from the wind, maybe from someone passing by. The castle is alive, not with a heart, but with sound. It never truly sleeps, even when everyone does. You lie there, listening. The wind howls from the tower, the windows rattle, and the dripping water keeps rhythm the stone drumbeat of time. Occasionally, a dull thud echoes from afar, maybe wood cracking in the cold, or something falling. The sound travels through the room, touches the walls, and fades like a sigh. The cold makes every noise sharper. Even the smallest sound feels close to your ear. You can hear the faint rustle of your wool blanket, the soft crack in your knuckles as you curl beneath it. Outside, the wind through the chimney turns into a long whistle, sometimes so human you can't tell if it's air or voice. People once believed that in winter nights, the wind carried the souls of the dead, circling the castle walls. Some knights swore they heard hooves galloping across the courtyard, even when the gate was shut. Maybe it was imagination, or maybe the memory of stone, which remembers every sound it's ever heard. You curl tighter, pulling the blanket up, but your ears stay open. You're not afraid, you're listening to a different kind of music. The sound of life within silence. Every small noise, no matter how faint, proves that something still stirs here. Something still breathes in the dark. And then, you hear wood creak. Maybe it's the ceiling beam contracting in the cold, or the bed trembling as someone turns over in the next room. The sound is steady, slow, like the castle breathing. A soft pop follows maybe a coal bursting in the fire. A tiny spark flares up, lighting the room for a heartbeat before dying away. In that moment, you see your shadow stretch long across the wall, distorted, then vanish. That shadow, along with every sound around you, makes you realize something. You're not alone. Not because someone is there, but because the past still is, living in the stone, the wind, the water. The mice scurry again. The wind shifts. And you understand that this song has no chorus, no beginning, no end. It's the heartbeat of a place that's seen hundreds of winters, and every winter, someone has lain here, listening just like you. As you close your eyes, the sounds merge into one, a lullaby of darkness. Not gentle, not warm, but honest. It tells you that even as time moves on, the castle still lives, still cold, still singing through wind, through water, through the tiny lives, seeking warmth in stone. You listen until the wind fades, the water stills, and only your heartbeat echoes in between. In that moment, you understand, even in the deepest silence, life is still stirring. Every sound is a reminder that silence knows how to sing, if you're patient enough to hear it. And so you lie still, listening as the night drifts by, hearing the cold sing through the rhythm of your own breath. You might think that living in a mighty fortress, surrounded by high stone walls, guarded soldiers, fine wine, and thick furs, would make a person feel secure. But in truth, there is no place lonelier than a castle on a winter night. The cold isn't just on your skin, it's inside you, a silence so heavy that even the sound of your heartbeat echoes back. It's past midnight now. The wind outside has weakened, but inside the walls, the chill still spreads like mist. You lie curled beneath your blanket, listening to the soft crackle of embers. The firelight fades, a waxy yellow glow casting fleeting patterns across the ceiling before vanishing. When the last flame dies, you realize the darkness here isn't the same as the darkness in the open fields. It's deeper, thicker, as if it could swallow you whole. Everything around you is quiet, but not peaceful. You hear wind slipping through a tiny hole in the wall, just enough to make the bed curtain tremble. You pull the blanket close to your neck and breathe softly. The scent of old wool, smoke and ash mixes with the damp smell of stone. It feels as though you're lying inside the body of a giant creature, one made of rock, sleeping, and you are just a speck of dust in its breath. In this place, silence becomes a voice. It speaks through emptiness. Every time you move and the blanket rustles, the sound ripples through the room and fades, leaving behind a heavy void. There's no conversation. No footsteps from servants, no horses outside, only you and the walls, and they do not answer. Loneliness in a castle isn't the same as loneliness in nature. In the forest, at least there are leaves, animals, and running water. Here, every sound is swallowed by stone. Even your breath seems to bounce back. You exhale and hear it echo. You cough softly, and the sound stretches, then disappears into silence. You sit up. The room is so dark you can't see your own hands. A sliver of pale light seeps through the crack in the door, cold and blue, like moonlight imprisoned. On the walls, old portraits emerge faintly. The faces in them stare at you, stern and distant people who once lived here, perhaps waking as you do now, in the same hour, in the same loneliness. People often say, a castle is a symbol of power. But what power can warm you? You may have hundreds of servants, yet at night, it's only you facing the dark. You may command armies, but you cannot command sleep to come sooner. Every person, king or soldier, must eventually lie down alone. And within these walls, that truth feels sharper than anywhere else. You think of the others in the fortress. They're scattered across the place. Guards in the towers, servants in the cellar, cooks curled up by the kitchen hearth. Each has their own flame, small, weak, flickering. Each flame like a distant star, separate, isolated, too far to touch the others. Even within the same castle, everyone lives in their own world. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's when no one can truly reach you. You remember the feasts, the laughter, the clinking of cups, the music, the shimmering cloaks. But when the feasts end, only the wind remains. That laughter now exists only in your memory, like a dream fading on waking. You lie down again, pulling the blanket tight, but it can't cover the emptiness. You feel small, lost inside this massive block of stone, a flicker of light adrift in a sea of darkness. Those who came before you, nobles, knights, dukes, must have also awakened in the night, hearing the wind, staring at the high ceiling, realizing they too were just grains of sand in the hourglass of time. Sometimes you hear footsteps echoing down a far corridor. You can't tell if it's a guard or the wind crossing the stairwell. Every sound in the castle could be an illusion. You wait for it to repeat, but it never does, leaving a silence even heavier than before. Loneliness makes the mind vivid. A shifting curtain can make your heart race. And then you think, perhaps it's this very solitude that made people of the past believe in spirits, in ghosts, in God. When you're surrounded by stone and darkness, you need to believe someone still hears you, even if it's invisible. In those centuries, people didn't pray because they feared death, but because they feared silence. You glance at the fireplace, the embers have gone out, leaving only a faint red glow. You poke it gently. A spark jumps, then dies. A brief moment, yet it makes you realize people are like those embers. Bright for a while, then fading into endless dark. And in the space between two glows, we call it loneliness. You lie still. Your heartbeat joins the faint dripping of water somewhere distant. The room hasn't changed, the wind is still cold, the walls still mute. But something inside you has softened. Perhaps because you've come to understand that this solitude isn't yours alone, it's something shared by everyone who's ever lived in this fortress. Every winter, every night, someone has lain here, hearing the same wind, feeling the same emptiness, asking the same unanswerable question. And maybe that's why people seek each other. In the morning, when the fire is lit again, when servants knock, when laughter returns, they'll talk about the cold, the night, the strange noises. They won't realize that during those silent hours, they all shared the same fear, the same trembling. The fortress still stands tall amid the snow, proud, magnificent, but inside, people remain small. Whether lord or servant, the long night makes them the same fragile beings searching for warmth among the stones, and as you close your eyes, you realize loneliness isn't really an enemy. It's the mirror of winter, reflecting something you've always known but rarely dared to face, that even within the strongest fortress, the human heart still trembles like a candle before the wind. In that skin-cutting cold, even sleep was a battle, and the only weapon humans had were layers of clothing, every thread, every stitch a shield against winter itself. You open the wooden chest in the corner of the room. Inside, there's no gold or silver, only clothes. So many, and all of them heavy. People back then had no padded coats, no electric blankets. They had wool, linen, leather, and the skill of the weavers, those quiet craftsmen who made the garments that kept people alive through endless nights. Before bed, a servant would help a noble change clothes. First came the linen layer, thin, white, light, and softer than any other fabric. Linen didn't hold heat well, but it absorbed moisture, keeping sweat off the skin and the body dry. To medieval people, linen was like a second skin, the only one that touched the flesh directly. If you look closely, almost every old painting shows nobles wearing white garments underneath that's linen, the foundation of every other layer. Once the linen hugged the body, came the wool. And not just one, at least two, sometimes three. Wool garments were hand-woven from sheep's wool that still held traces of natural lanolin, giving them a particular scent, a mix of animal fat, earth, and smoke. To us, it might smell bad, but to them, it was the scent of life. That grease in the fibers trapped warmth, repelled water, and softened the fabric. When you slipped into one of those garments, it scratched your neck and wrists, but warmth bloomed immediately. Some people even rubbed beeswax or oil along the cuffs to block out the drafts. Over the wool came the long outer coat, worn day and night. Made from thick wool or suede, it was as heavy as a blanket. When lying down, people didn't take it off, they just loosened the ties and pulled another blanket over it. Some even kept their soft armor on underneath, not from fear of attack, but because it kept them warm. One knight once wrote to a friend, "I sleep in my coat, for if I remove it, by morning I may not rise." Feet, the coldest part of all, got special care. Woolen socks were essential, but they weren't snug like modern ones. They were loose, coarse, and slipped easily. Many wrapped cloth around their ankles to keep them in place. Others, especially peasants, stuffed dry straw into their shoes before bed. Straw trapped heat, absorbed moisture, and by morning you could simply shake it out and replace it. The warm, grassy scent mixed with wool and smoke, creating that unmistakable smell of a medieval winter. As for the hands, people wore gloves or wrapped cloth around their wrists. Cold hands were dangerous when your fingers went numb. You couldn't light a fire or hold a cup of warm wine. Night guards tucked their hands under their armpits for warmth, while those indoors hid them under blankets or inside coats. But the strangest and most familiar thing was the nightcap. If you've ever seen old paintings, you'll notice those long, pointed hats that droop down, sometimes tied under the chin. They weren't decoration. They were the final defense against drafts. The head loses heat fastest, so no one ever slept bareheaded. The caps were made of soft wool or thick linen, with a tail long enough to wrap around the neck like a scarf. They looked funny, and indeed, later generations mocked them. But in the cold dark of stone chambers, that hat was a blessing from God. Some even believed wearing one kept nightmares away, as cold air couldn't sneak into the ears. Once dressed in every layer, people sat down on the bed, but still, their bodies trembled. No one slept with just a single garment. The European winter was so harsh that if you forgot an extra layer, you might wake up with your hair frozen stiff. Surviving journals tell of nights like this. When I exhale, my breath freezes upon my blanket and hair. By morning, it turns to ice. So, preparing for sleep back then was like preparing for battle. Servants helped their masters into each layer, checked the cap, pulled up the blankets, and laid extra furs at the feet. Some even placed a small pot of coals beneath the bed for a few minutes to warm it, then removed it quickly, fearing smoke or fire. And when everything was finally ready, they lay down carefully, as if every movement might awaken the cold lurking in the walls. Imagine it. Your body wrapped tight, only your eyes exposed. Your warm breath fogs the cloth above your face, turning to mist. The scratch of wool against skin is rough, but familiar. Every movement makes a soft, rustling sound, like tiny waves beneath a frozen sea. Your body feels heavy, but your mind grows light. Beneath all those layers, your skin starts to warm, your blood slows, your breathing evens out. In a world of stone and wind, this is the only way to find peace, to hide inside fabric. Some say that if you slept without clothes in a medieval castle, you wouldn't live till morning, just a few hours. But if you knew how to wrap yourself in linen, wool, and a cap, you could survive the winter night and wake when sunlight touched the stone walls. Then, the thin frost on your hat would melt away, revealing a face still pink from the warmth you managed to keep. And so, every night, thousands across Europe cocooned themselves in layers of cloth. They didn't just sleep, they took shelter. They hid from the wind, from the stone, from the cold of the world outside. They might not have had warm beds, but they had wool, faith, and the quiet belief that with enough layers they'd make it through the night. You shift slightly beneath the thick layers of clothing, hearing the faint scrape of fabric against your skin, rough, coarse, but strangely warm. The scent around you isn't perfume, nor the herbal fragrance noble ladies like to wear, but something raw, primal, and very real. The smell of sheep's fat. Wool back then wasn't soft like we know it today. It was the wild material of the old world, unrefined, unwashed, untouched by polish. The fleece was shorn straight from living sheep, shaken out in the wind, then spun into yarn. Inside each strand remained traces of lanolin, the natural oil sheep produced to protect themselves from rain and snow. That oil was what made the difference between the warmth of today and the warmth of the Middle Ages. It had a smell strong, fatty, slightly sour, but to those who lived then, it was the smell of survival. When you put on that wool garment, you could feel its roughness, as if being embraced by the sheep itself. It wasn't soft or elegant, but it gave real heat. Many poor villagers owned only one such garment, wearing it all year, heavy in summer, salvation in winter. To them, wool wasn't just clothing, but a second skin that kept them alive through the cold. The elders used to say, "Sheep's fat has a smell, but it's the scent of breath, not decay." And when you step into a weaving room, where mothers and young girls sit spinning by the fire, you understand. The air is thick with warmth, smoke, and lanolin, an intense scent, not pleasant, but comforting. Every strand of wool is spun slowly, evenly, as they hum old lullabies, the rhythm of the wheel like the heartbeat of winter itself. Even the nobility wore wool, though finer, smoother, and often dyed in colour. Yet whether your garment came from a small village or a grand French workshop, its essence was the same. Wool was the warmth of the sheep, and the warmth of the sheep was the warmth of the earth. Imagine yourself in that frozen room, the wind howling outside, everything stiff with frost. You curl up, the coarse wool scratching your neck and arms. Each thread seems to cling to your skin, refusing to let your heat escape. Your breath turns to mist, then fades against your shoulder, the smell of lanolin rising stronger now, thick and fatty, but a reminder that you're alive. Someone once said, "As long as you can smell it, you'll live through the winter." Servants grew so used to it that they no longer noticed. They wore wool from childhood, played in the snow, worked outdoors, and slept in it. Sweat, smoke, and sheep blended into one their bodies and garments, becoming a single living thing. Only nobles, used to linen and silk, complained when forced to wear wool too long. They itched, they cursed the smell, but when the night wind came, they fell silent, because the very thing they despised was what kept them from freezing to death. In the northern lands, there was an old saying, "Without wool, man would turn to snow." It sounds like a joke, but it's true. For centuries, wool stood between humankind and winter, not only on the body but over beds, around necks, inside shoes, hung as curtains, laid as blankets. A castle without wool was like a lamp without oil. It might glow for a moment, then go out. Archaeologists have found charred bits of wool in the ruins of castles dyed brown, black, red remnants of blankets and cloaks, long devoured by time. Under the microscope, you can still see frozen drops of lanolin on the fibers, preserved for hundreds of years. The same sheep's oil that once shielded people from snow now protects the fabric from decay, as if the sheep were still guarding humankind even after death. You listen to the wind outside and pull your coat closer. The faint scent of lanolin lingers among the ashes, but now it doesn't bother you. That smell reminds you that in this world, no luxury exists without something humble beneath it. Wool, coarse, ordinary, rustic, was the foundation of European life for 1,000 years. There's something deeply human in those threads. They're imperfect, uneven, but faithful. They endure dirt, smoke, rain, and snow. They itch, but never betray. And people, knight or peasant, were all the same when night fell. They sought warmth in wool's embrace. And so, the night drifts on, filled with the scent of sheep's fat and fragile heat. Outside, the snow still falls, the wind still howls, but beneath the heavy wool, you feel your heartbeat slow. The warmth no longer escapes, it turns inward. A sense of safety, almost primal, surrounds you. This warmth isn't cozy like an electric blanket or a modern fire, it's alive. It's the warmth of survival. You may have seen it in old paintings. A long nightcap with a pointed tip drooping over the shoulder, sometimes wrapped around the neck like a small snake. To modern eyes, it looks ridiculous, like something a jester from a fairy tale would wear. But to medieval people, that hat was indispensable, a talisman of sleep, the final line between cold and survival. Imagine this. It's a winter night. The castle torches are out, stone walls frozen solid, only the faint red glow of embers left. You crawl under your blanket, wearing 3 layers of clothes, wool wrapped tight around your body, and still, the cold remains. Cold at your head. It's not like the cold of your hands or feet. It slides through your hair, slips into your ears, creeps down your neck, making your whole body tense. And that's when the nightcap takes its throne. Medieval people called it many names. Nightcap, sleep hood, or coif. Whatever the name, its purpose was the same. To trap warmth in the place where the body loses it fastest, the head. But more than that, it was a shield against drafts, against the howling wind through the cracks, even against the loneliness that seeped through long nights. The nightcap was usually made of linen or soft wool, sometimes lined with rabbit fur or coarse cotton if the wearer was wealthy enough. But the distinctive part was its tail, a long strip of fabric that could drape around the neck like a scarf or hang loose over the shoulders. It was practical, but also emotional. People felt safer with something draped around their neck as they slept, as if an invisible arm were holding them close. Some even said, "If my head is bare, my soul will wander in the wind." Superstition maybe, but it captured a real truth. Without a cap, you felt naked before the storm. The funny thing was, the nightcap wasn't elegant. It was wrinkled, soft, and often lopsided. When worn, the long tip dangled and swayed, making anyone who saw it laugh. In Renaissance satirical paintings, old men in nightcaps became symbols of foolishness. But those fools were the wisest of all. They knew that when the head is warm, the whole body is warm. And indeed, in the medieval cold, without a nightcap, you simply couldn't sleep. The wind blew through the walls, the chill touched your scalp, soaked through your hair, numbed your skull. Stories tell of noblemen waking with their hair frozen stiff. A French lady in the 14th century wrote in her journal, "I slept without a cap, and in the morning, my ears ached as if stabbed by needles." She later commissioned a silk cap trimmed with rabbit fur, and soon the nightcap became fashionable among the nobility. Commoners were more practical. They used whatever they could, old wool, fabric scraps, even the torn sleeve of an old coat. They cut, stitched, wrapped, and wore it. It didn't need to be pretty, only warm. Children had their own caps, so did the elderly. One old weaver once said, "When I die, bury me with this cap. It's been my friend through 30 winters." In the darkness, the cap didn't just warm the body, it brought comfort. You knew that as long as you had it, your head would stay warm, your breath wouldn't freeze mid-sleep. Those who endured their first winter without a nightcap never forgot it. The feeling of hundreds of icy needles piercing their scalp. A Welsh folk song once said, He who sleeps with a bare head will dream of winds screaming through his heart. More than that, the nightcap carried social meaning. It was a symbol of privacy. When a man or woman put on their nightcap, it meant they had withdrawn from the world. No more formality, no more rank, no more knight or lady, just a person and sleep. A knight in his nightcap looked no different from his servant. That's why, in many noble houses, no one but family was allowed to see the master or mistress once the cap was on. It was their rare moment of vulnerability when they had no armour, no title, only a wrinkled bit of cloth cradling their head. And of course, like everything in those times, nightcaps had hierarchy. The wealthy wore caps embroidered with gold thread, silver buttons and fur trim, while the poor had plain wool. But no matter how they differed in appearance, their purpose was the same: to fight the cold. In harsh lands like Scotland or the North, the nightcap was considered essential clothing. To go outside at night without one was to be thought mad. There were even funny stories about them. One tells of a famously short-tempered count whose cap lost its tip in the night, letting cold air creep down his neck. By morning, he was so furious he punished his servant for failing to guard his cap. From then on, one servant's sole duty was to watch over the Lord's nightcap while he slept. The tale spread through the region as a joke, but it reminded everyone even the powerful could be defeated by a single breath of cold wind. Sometimes children played with the long tail of their caps, twirling it and laughing. Adults wrapped it around their necks for comfort. On stormy nights, families would huddle together, each with their nightcaps, looking like a nest of doves. The wind howled outside, but inside there was only steady breathing and the soft rustle of fabric brushing together. You reach up and touch the soft cloth on your head. The faint scent of wool lingers, warmth spreads from your forehead down your neck. In that moment you realize, this cap doesn't just warm your head, it steadies your mind. It keeps the cold from seeping into your thoughts, keeps fear from creeping into your dreams. A small thing, yet the final barrier between humankind and the frost beyond the walls. In a medieval castle, everything is cold except the things that cling closest to people, and the nightcap, small, silly, but loyal, is one of those few precious things. In the Middle Ages, blankets weren't just bedding, they were an art of survival. Because if you layered them wrong, or slept the wrong way, by morning you might never wake again. In a world of stone and wind, blankets were the only miracle humans could make for themselves. And over hundreds of winters, people learned how to turn rough fabric into the warmest armor they had. Let's start with the first rule. One blanket was never enough. In castles, every bed had at least 3 layers: linen, wool, and fur. Linen always came first, smooth and cool, laid directly on the skin. People believed linen kept the soul clean during sleep, but in truth, it was excellent at absorbing moisture. As you slept, the dampness of your body soaked into the linen instead of clinging to your skin, helping you avoid chills, a vital defense in Europe's damp climate. On top of the linen came the wool blanket, the soul of the medieval bed. Each wool blanket was thick, heavy, and carried that familiar scent of sheep's fat. People joked, the heavier the blanket, the deeper the sleep. And it was true in a winter night. The weight didn't just trap heat, it pinned the body down, keeping the wind from slipping through. The wealthy commissioned oversized, double-thick wool blankets, while the poor stitched together old clothes, scraps of fabric, even grain sacks layer upon layer to make a makeshift cover. And on top, the final layer: fur. If wool was the breath of sheep, fur was the warmth of the forest. It trapped heat incredibly well, especially with the hide still on. People favored bear, wolf, deer, hare, or mountain sheep. Beyond comfort, furs carried meaning. Bear symbolized strength, wolf power, deer nobility, while hare and sheep belonged to common folk. Those who slept beneath them weren't just seeking warmth. They were lying under symbols of status woven into their dreams. But the real secret wasn't in the materials, it was in the layering. Servants preparing the bed had to get it right, or their master might wake shivering at midnight. Linen below, then wool, then fur with the hair turned inward to trap heat. If reversed, the cold hide would drain warmth from the body. Servants were trained to smooth every fold, remove every air gap. Once finished, they laid a thin linen sheet over the top to keep off dust, then stepped back quietly. A small mistake, a crooked fold or misaligned corner, could earn a scolding, even punishment, for making the master cold in the night. To medieval people, a bed wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a fortress within the long night. When wind howled against the walls, when water dripped from the ceiling, when fog crept through the door cracks, it was within those layers of fabric that a person found their one fragile sense of safety. Each time you pulled the blanket up to your neck, it was like retreating into your final defense against the frozen world beyond. The blankets of that time weren't light, soft, or fragrant. They were heavy, coarse, and often damp. But people loved them, because every blanket represented months of labor, from the shepherd, the shearer, the spinner, the weaver, to the seamstress. Some blankets were passed down through generations, patched, mended, with old colours still visible, holding the warmth of ancestors. In many noble wills, they were mentioned by name. The thick wool blanket of my mother to my eldest daughter. To them, a blanket wasn't just an object, it was an heirloom of warmth. And perhaps you'll smile knowing this. Medieval people had their own techniques to warm their blankets before bed. Servants would place a heated stone wrapped in cloth in the middle of the bed for a few minutes, or use a small brazier for temporary heat. Then they'd remove it quickly, lest smoke or sparks catch the fabric. Some nights, masters ordered servants to warm the blankets by the fireplace. They'd shake and flap the blankets over the heat until every thread soaked up warmth, then fold them fast and rush them to bed. Crawling under those freshly warmed covers was described as a rare moment when one could forget that stone existed. The poor were more inventive. They hung their wool blankets above the hearth to dry and warm, then carried them to bed. The smell of smoke clung to the fabric, but in exchange, they had dry, warm covers all night. Whole families shared one bed and one blanket. Sometimes 5 or 6 people lay side by side like small logs in a fire, just to hold on to what little heat there was. Human warmth mingled with wool, with linen, with fur together, forming a cocoon for winter. A 15th century diary once said, "I love the smell of an old wool blanket, for it holds all that is human sweat, smoke, dreams, and survival." It sounds poetic, but it was the plain truth. In that cold world, people didn't seek happiness, only a way to wake up the next morning, and the blankets, heavy, old, sometimes torn, were their most loyal companions in that fight. If you placed your hand on a medieval wool blanket, you'd feel its dampness, its weight, its rough texture. But once you pulled it to your shoulders, warmth would slowly spread through your body. The blanket wasn't fragrant, but it was real, not smooth, but alive. In the chill of stone, it was the roughness of wool, linen, and fur, not silk or velvet, that kept a heartbeat alive. Outside, snow still falls, the wind still moans through the walls, but beneath those layers, someone sleeps. A peasant, a servant, a noble, or a knight, all the same. Curled up, knees drawn in, pulling the blanket to their chin, exhaling softly, letting their warmth fade gently into the night. Now picture this. You walk into a room inside an old castle. Downstairs, where the servants sleep, the floor is covered in dry straw, the smell of burnt grass and sweat mixing together, damp but warm. Upstairs, where the nobles rest, stands a massive bed draped in white linen, thick wool blankets, furs, and a feather mattress. And just by looking at where someone sleeps, you could tell exactly who they were. In the medieval world, even sleep had a class system. Not everyone got to lie between warm sheets. Even though everyone faced the same winter cold, the way they fought it showed their place in society brutally and clearly. For the poor, a bed was just a pile of straw or hay spread across the floor. They'd gather it up, throw an old cloth over it, and curl beside the fire. Every time they turned, the straw crackled, dust flew, and their noses stung. Straw wasn't soft, but it was warm. It was the earth's cheap gift, a natural barrier between man and stone. Many poor families never changed their straw through winter. They simply added more when the old layers flattened. The smell of straw mixed with people, with smoke, creating a scent that was earthy, alive, and real. Servants in castles didn't fare much better. They slept on the kitchen floor or near the stables, the only places with heat. A thin linen sheet, a few handfuls of straw, and a wool coat, that was all. Some slept under their masters' long dining tables. close enough to serve at dawn and steal a little warmth from the hearth. In larger castles, servants had their own quarters, but the rooms were low, damp, and the ceilings dripped. When the wind blew and curtains trembled, they curled tighter and prayed to God to see the morning. But upstairs, in the noble chambers, the bed was a throne of power. A grand wooden frame carved with detail, with posts, curtains, even steps to climb because the bed was so high. On top lay a mattress stuffed with goose or swan feathers, a luxury commoners would never touch. The thicker and softer the bed, the higher the status. Some nobles even tucked sachets of herbs and dried flowers into the mattress not for comfort, but to sleep in the scent of wealth. Yet the truth was ironic. Feather beds were soft, yes, but not always pleasant. If the feathers weren't packed tightly enough, they poked through, stabbing the back. Many nobles complained that their mattresses pricked like needles or itched like hay. Meanwhile, peasants slept soundly on straw, too tired to care, too used to the roughness of the earth. Sometimes, that divide was heartbreakingly clear. In the same castle, the master slept under furs, while his servant lay on the floor by his feet, without a blanket, just a coat. One person's warmth was another's cold. One fire, two worlds. Yet, here's the twist. Luxury beds weren't always warm. No matter how large the castle, it was still freezing. Many nobles, even wrapped in fur and feathers, slept in 3 layers of clothing. Meanwhile, the poor sleeping close together, sharing breath, were often warmer. An old saying went, "A big bed won't keep you warm, only another person will." And in the dark, that saying rang true. One weaver once said, "I slept in a castle while weaving cloth for them. My bed was large and high, but cold as a grave. I missed my little straw bed." Simple words, but a truth few dared admit. Power can't buy a peaceful sleep. Feather beds were treasured property, even listed in wills. In 15th century England, records show entries like, "My mother's feather bed to my youngest daughter, along with 2 linen pillows and a red wool blanket." In that society, inheriting a bed meant inheriting warmth, a rare thing money couldn't easily buy. In monasteries, where monks lived in austerity, beds were plain wooden planks covered in straw. They believed sleeping too comfortably was sinful. Some even chose to lie on coarse mats or rough armor to train the soul against the temptation of warmth. In the stone-cold dark of the church, they prayed while trembling. To them, cold was penance, warmth was weakness. But for ordinary folk, warmth wasn't luxury, it was happiness. In winter, when people gathered straw, patched blankets, and stoked fires, the whole village worked together, as if in a ritual. They didn't dream of feather beds, only of a dry spot, someone beside them, and a blanket without holes. That warmth, though small, was more real than any wealth. Think about it. 2 people sleep in winter, one on a feather mattress, cold and alone, the other on straw, hearing fire crackle, feeling another's breath, and sleeping peacefully. Who is truly rich? Back then, the answer was clear. The one who had warmth, even if it was just another person's breath, was the richest of all. Those with high beds, fur blankets, and wide rooms, but no one beside them, had only stone. And stone is cold. Sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just rest, it was a measure of status. Every blanket, every straw, every feather pillow told the world who you were. But in the end, when night fell, when wind howled through the towers, when both rich and poor closed their eyes, everyone wanted the same thing: to wake up in the morning and still be alive. If someone tells you that a feather bed is heaven and a straw bed is hell, just smile and tell them they've never slept through a medieval winter. Because back then, even heaven was cold, and hell was sometimes a little warmer. Let's start with straw, the bed of the poor, but also the foundation of the truest kind of sleep. Golden, dry, smelling sharply of earth and grass, gathered from the harvest, dried under the sun, then stuffed into rough sacks or spread directly on the floor. At night, people laid it thick, a hand's width deep, threw a cloth on top, and curled up tight. When you lay down, the straw rustled, making a sound both noisy and familiar, like the whisper of wind through autumn fields. Every time you turned, it crackled again, a reminder that you were still alive. But straw was far from comfortable. It was stiff, It poked your back, and if it got old, it turned damp, cold, even mouldy. Some said they had to toss it out every morning to dry, because their own body heat had made it heavy and clumped. Straw was also home to fleas, lice, and mice. Tiny creatures that, while annoying, were simply part of life. Many poor folks joked, "When we sleep, the fleas sleep with us because they're cold too." And yet, in all that hardship, straw gave one thing: real warmth. It was rough, but it held heat well. When you lay in a heap of it, your body warmth got trapped in the layers, slowly spreading, turning the pile into a little nest. The first night was bitter cold, but by the second, the straw had absorbed your warmth and became a trusted refuge. Villagers rarely replaced all the straw. They just added fresh layers on top of the old, believing the old straw carried the spirit of warmth. Meanwhile, up in the castle, where power and luxury reigned, the feather bed was a symbol of pride and sometimes a cruel joke. Mattresses stuffed with goose, swan, or duck feathers were piled so high you needed steps to climb up. When you sat down, the bed sank, so soft it seemed to swallow you whole. It sounded perfect until you realized the price of softness. Feathers, unless thoroughly dried, trapped moisture from the air. In cold, damp castles, a feather mattress was like a giant sponge. At night, when temperatures dropped, that trapped moisture turned icy, seeping back into your skin. You might lie in the finest bed money could buy, but the cold still crawled through the fine linen, down to your bones. And so, you shivered in luxury while the servants downstairs, sleeping on dry straw, were actually warmer. Worse yet, the feather bed was alive. Inside, the feathers left little gaps for air and for small creatures. After a few winters, the mattress became a perfect home for bedbugs, those tiny monsters no one could escape, not even counts or kings. Letters from the Middle Ages tell of noblemen and ladies changing their mattresses each season because the bed moved as if it had waves. And still, they refused to give up feathers because they were a symbol of status. A noble couldn't be seen lying on straw like a peasant. So straw and feathers, two extremes of society, existed side by side in a strange irony. Straw was rough, but real. Feathers were soft, but false. Straw scratched your back but reminded you still had skin. Feathers caressed you, but cooled with every breath. Straw rustled loudly. Feathers lay in terrifying silence. In the dark, the poor heard the sound of straw, the rich heard the sound of their own heartbeat. One knight once confessed in his journal, "I have lain upon the feather bed of a king, but I slept best as a soldier, on damp straw in a wooden hut." It wasn't just nostalgia, it was truth. The closer man is to the earth, the closer his sleep is to peace. Still, don't think straw belonged only to the poor. In years of famine or war, even nobles turned back to it. When feathers were scarce, they mixed straw with herbs, calling it God's temporary bed. And strangely, they found they slept better. The earthy scent of straw, of hay and hearth smoke, reminded them of childhood, of fields, of a simpler life that luxury could never buy. Some castles even kept both straw beds below, feather beds above, so each could choose their kind of sleep. But in time, people learned that the true difference wasn't in material, it was in human warmth. A feather bed, no matter how fine, stayed cold if you slept alone. But a straw bed, no matter how rough, grew warm when two bodies shared it. A 14th century German monastery record said, "When pilgrims arrive, we give them dry straw and a bowl of warm soup. They sleep deeper than those in palaces." That story spread across Europe as a reminder that warmth doesn't come from possessions, but from breath, from kindness. And now, looking back, that contrast paints the truest picture of medieval life. Straw, poor, coarse, humble, but tied to real life. Feathers rich, soft, elegant, but distant from the earth. And in that winter night, between those two worlds, one thing united them. Both dreamed the same dream to wake up, see light slip through the cracks, and hear the rooster's call announcing a day no colder than the last. Because in those times, surviving the night was reason enough to thank God. And perhaps, in the dark of both stone castles and thatched huts, no one was truly different as all wrapped themselves in blankets and prayed for the dawn. People often think medieval nobles lived in perfect comfort, eating fine food, wearing silk, and sleeping on beds as soft as clouds. But if you've ever read their real letters, you'd laugh. Because it turns out, those feather beds they were so proud of were actually torturing them every night. Luxury, like everything else in that age, came with a price, and sometimes that price was a sleepless night full of goose feather stabs. Feather mattresses in the 14th and 15th centuries were considered the height of wealth. They were stuffed with thousands of goose-down feathers, swan fluff, or duck-down birds raised specifically for noble bedding. The feathers were plucked by hand, washed in river water, then smoked to remove odour. It sounded elaborate, but the result wasn't as heavenly as it looked. Goose feathers, if not properly treated, still had hard quills, and when packed into a mattress, those stiff, sharp spines slowly poked through the fabric and into the sleeper's skin. At first, it was just a light sting. But as the cold night dragged on, every turn of the body pressed the weight down, sending the army of quills into attack. The result? A proud lord suddenly leaping out of bed, shouting as if he'd been stabbed. Old letters tell hilarious stories. One English lady wrote to her sister, "I have a new feather bed, but I swear even my enemies do not deserve such torture. I lie as if on a hedgehog's nest." The story spread fast, becoming the joke of noble circles. Mattress makers were scolded, while poor villagers just shrugged. "Our straw never stabbed anyone," they said. And so, while peasants slept peacefully on piles of dry straw, the rich spent their nights wrestling with luxury. In some French castles, noblemen even ordered their servants to beat the mattress every night before bed, hitting it hard with wooden sticks to soften the feathers and push the quills down. The thumping echoed through the halls like a nightly ritual. Servants would pray as they worked. "May God make the feathers stay down tonight." But apparently God had other priorities, because every morning someone woke up with red marks on their back. A note from the Nobleman's Handbook of Burgundy advised, "If your mattress pricks, add a layer of linen and 2 wool blankets, but do not remove the bed. For suffering a little still looks nobler than sleeping on straw." That line perfectly summed up the medieval mindset. Better to suffer in luxury than rest in poverty. Some nobles even quarrelled over their mattresses. One Italian count, famous for his temper, demanded his feather bed be refilled every winter. Servants plucked new swan down, washed, dried, and restuffed it. Yet he still complained, "It's as hard as before." Finally, one old servant quietly took a sack of straw, covered it with white linen, and placed it on his bed without saying a word. The next morning the count awoke, beaming, "At last, this new feather bed is soft as clouds." No one dared tell him he'd just slept on the cook's straw. That story spread quickly and still appears in history books today, a perfect example of noble foolishness. People laughed, but behind the humour was a truth about luxury's illusion. Sometimes, what we call refinement is just a prettier form of discomfort. Featherbeds had another problem too. They made noise. When damp, every movement produced a faint creak and rustle, as if the bed were whispering. In the stillness of night, the sound was unmistakable and eerie. Some noble women believed their beds were haunted because of the strange noises. Priests were called in to bless the room, only to discover the culprit was a few wet feathers. So, medieval luxury sleep wasn't so relaxing after all. To have a soft bed, one had to pay in money, effort, and a few scratches. Yet they still clung to the habit, because the feather bed wasn't just a place to rest, it was a symbol of power. Visitors who saw a tall bed draped in white linen and puffed up with feathers instantly knew the master was someone of importance. Straw beds, though warm, were the mark of commoners. And yet, it was in these contradictions that medieval life felt most human. Because sometimes, in the cold of night, a noblewoman's sigh over a stabbing mattress was no different from the laughter of a servant downstairs. Both were simply trying to sleep through the winter with patience and a sense of humour. Maybe that's why people back then learned to laugh through hardship. When the cold refused to ease, when wind slipped through the walls, when rich and poor alike shivered in their sleep, a laugh, even a small one, was the warmest fire of all. Servants told jokes about the count afraid of feathers, while noble women teased each other about the biting bed. The castle filled with quiet laughter, and for a moment all ranks became the same. Just people, fighting the cold, seeking warmth, and still finding a way to smile, even when the bed was hard, the blanket thin, or the feathers stabbed their backs. In medieval society, when you closed your eyes for the last time, your possessions would be divided: lands, horses, jewelry, weapons, and your bed. It sounds strange, but it's true. A bed was once considered as valuable as treasure. A bed wasn't just a place to rest. It was a symbol of status, lineage, and power. Imagine a dying count in his cold stone castle. Beside him stood not only his priest and servants, but also the scribe writing his will. And among lines like, "I leave my son the western lands," or "my 10 war horses in the stable," there would be another. "And the great bed in the upper chamber, with its woolen blankets and feather pillows, I leave to my beloved wife." These lines are real, found in hundreds of wills across medieval Europe. Why? Because making a bed back then was far more costly and elaborate than you might think. First, the bed frame. Not just 4 wooden legs, but an entire structure. Oak or walnut, carved with intricate detail, polished, sometimes inlaid with ivory or gilded with gold. Each bedpost could stand as tall as a man, holding up a canopy above from which hung heavy curtains of wool, velvet, or brocade. Many beds even bore the family's crest carved into the headboard, so when guests visited, one look told them whose lineage ruled the house. A bed was power embodied in furniture. Then came the mattress, blankets, and pillows. A proper noble set included a goose feather mattress, thick wool blankets, furs, and at least 2 hand-embroidered linen pillows. All made by skilled artisans over weeks, even months. A complete bed could cost as much as a warhorse, sometimes more. So it's no wonder beds were listed clearly in inheritance papers. But a bed wasn't just valuable, it was sacred. It was where a person was born, loved, fell ill, and died. Many believed the soul left the body from the very place one slept, giving the bed a kind of breath of life. To pass down a bed was to pass down the spirit of the family. There was an old French saying, "Whoever lies upon the bed of their ancestors continues their bloodline." That's why, when the eldest son inherited a title, his first act wasn't to claim the sword or seal, but to lie on his father's bed. It was a symbolic ritual, declaring, from this moment, he was truly the master of the house. But not everyone got to sleep on such a bed. In the same castle, only the great bed was preserved with care, while servants and even younger family members slept on small beds, straw mats, or directly on the floor. The great bed always stood in the main chamber, in the heart of the castle near the fire, the light, and sometimes even used to receive guests. Yes, guests didn't just sit near the bed, they sat on it. Back then, a bed wasn't private the way it is today. It was a display piece, a symbol of wealth and hospitality. In 15th century England, there was a famous bed known as the Great Bed of Ware. Over 3 meters wide, it could fit 4 couples at once, carved with ornate flowers and patterns. It became so well known that Shakespeare mentioned it in his plays A Sleeping Throne that drew visitors from all over to marvel at it. But for those who actually lived in castles, a bed wasn't for show. It was refuge. In winter, when walls froze, floors turned to ice, and curtains couldn't stop the drafts, the bed with its heavy drapes, thick blankets, and animal hides became a fortress within a fortress. When you pulled the curtains closed, the wind faded, the light dimmed, and the warmth stayed trapped inside. In that small, dark cocoon, the bed became your own private world. Small, but safe. The wealthy even had summer beds and winter beds. Summer beds were lighter, with fewer blankets, made of pine. Winter beds were heavy, dense, layered with wool and fur. Some nobles even travelled with their own beds, kings and generals carrying them on campaign, believing only in their own bed could they truly sleep well and avoid bad omens. Servants held special duties for their master's bed. Every morning, they shook out the blankets, fluffed the pillows, and aired the mattress if the sun was out. When the master was away, they covered it in white cloth to keep off dust and damp. Only the most trusted servant could touch the bed. It was both intimate and sacred. There are records of servants being dismissed simply for sitting on their lord's bed, seen as an insult to the dignity of his sleep. Perhaps that's why, in so many European legends, ghosts, curses, and love all revolve around the bed. People believed an old bed could hold memories of its owner. If someone died unjustly, their spirit might linger in the mattress, causing nightmares for whoever slept there next. But if a loving couple shared a bed, it would keep their warmth, blessing their descendants with luck. Today, we sleep on foam or spring mattresses, and no one would dream of putting a bed in a will. But in the Middle Ages, when winter could kill, a bed was the line between life and death, between power and fear. To keep your bed was to keep your honor. To pass it down was to pass down your family's warmth. And when night fell, whether king, count, or peasant, everyone returned to the same place, the one spot where all power melted away in the quiet breath of sleep. By day, they were men who made entire kingdoms bow, knights in shining armor, swords at their sides, horses plated in steel ready to charge into battle for honor. But when night fell, beneath the gleam and glory, they became small, shivering creatures caught between stone and frost. If you could peek through the door of a medieval knight's room on a winter night, you'd understand why people called it the age of trembling woolen lumps. They returned from long days, armor hung on the wall, sword by the bed, torchlight fading. No neighing horses, no war cries, only the howl of wind through arrow slits. Muscles sore, skin numb. And then, the man who had faced death without fear began his nightly battle with the weakest enemy of all the cold. The servant prepared the bed. Linen sheets, wool blankets, and furs were neatly layered. A small brazier glowed under the frame for a brief moment's warmth. The knight changed clothes. 1 layer of linen, 2 of wool, a thick cloak, wool socks, and a nightcap, the kind with a long floppy tail that drooped like a rabbit's ear. At that point, he looked less like a warrior and more like a giant sheep wrapped for winter. As brave as they were by day, by night they were awkward. Some tried to tuck the blankets around their necks, only to have them slip to the floor. Others pulled their legs in so tight they could barely move. They lay there, breathing little clouds of frost into the dark. In that moment, all their knightly dignity melted away, leaving only a lumpy figure rolling around in the night. One historian wrote, "There is no sight more tragic and comic than a knight in his nightclothes. The same men who once shouted, 'For glory,' on the battlefield were now whispering, 'Fetch another blanket, quickly.' In the cold, the older ones, their joints aching from war wounds, suffered worst. They groaned, 'I could endure a blade, but not a breeze through my nose.' Some even developed the habit of sleeping in armor, not metal but wool. 3, sometimes 4 layers, until their bodies stiffened like logs. By morning, servants had to peel each layer off them because they couldn't move their arms. One young soldier wrote, 'Last night I dreamed I was tied up by the enemy. Then I woke and realized it was just my nightclothes.' Stories like these travelled fast between castles. One knight from Normandy, famous for boasting, was once caught, battling. His blankets, they were so thick he tripped over them and rolled right off the bed. A servant recalled, 'He hit the floor with a clang like armor, though it was only wool on stone.' The next morning, the knight muttered, 'I was practicing evasive maneuvers in my sleep.' A certain count had an even stranger habit. He made his servants stand guard over the fire all night. If the flames dimmed, he'd wake shouting, 'Stoke it up! I'm turning to stone.' The servants, exhausted and bleary-eyed, dared not complain. One night, the fire went out, and by morning they found him curled in his blankets, pale but still mumbling, 'A knight fears no cold.' The truth was, everyone did. Noble or common, man or woman, the medieval winter made all equal in the harshest way, and in that misery, people learned to laugh just to survive. In many castles, servants whispered jokes. By day, he slays dragons, by night, the blankets slay him. And perhaps those small mischievous laughs were the only real warmth in winter. Even the ladies joined in. In a surviving love letter, a noblewoman wrote to her husband, "You are brave in battle, my lord, yet the blankets conquer you in bed. When you return, bring with you the fire of your glory to warm my side." Historians call it a perfect example of love in the cold, tender and teasing at once. Strangely, the colder life was the more humour people found. The cold stripped away pride. A slip on the ice, a cough from smoke, a night spent frozen stiff. It was all just part of life. And when they laughed at it, they felt more human. Those long winter nights became nights of storytelling and laughter by the hearth. Tales of knights tangled in blankets, counts terrified of draughts, and ladies dueling with fur quilts spread from one hall to another. Masters and servants laughed together, because everyone knew the cold spared no one. In moments like these, you see the real face of the Middle Ages, not just swords and blood and glory, but people fragile, foolish, and beautifully human. When a brave knight could shiver and a mighty lord could fear the cold, they were no longer legends, just people, closer to us than we think. Ice respected no title, the wind bowed to no name. Everyone had to find their own woolen armour, their own small laugh, their own little warmth to survive the night. And when morning came, as the weak sun filtered through frosted windows, those trembling woolen lumps rose once more, donning armour, grasping swords, stepping into the courtyard to the sound of horses. No one would guess that just hours before, they'd been curled under blankets, praying for the sun to rise a little sooner. After all the layers of linen and wool were on, after the hat and the thick blanket were pulled tight, the people of the Middle Ages still had to face the final enemy of the winter night, the kind of cold that crept straight into the bones. And so, they discovered their strongest weapon, fur. It wasn't just warmth, it was power, a symbol of primal instinct that even nobles couldn't hide. From the first winters that pressed against cold stone walls, people learned one truth. Only the skins of creatures that survived the snow could protect them from it. And so, they began bringing the wild forest into their beds. At first, furs were purely practical. Peasants hunted rabbits, foxes, or mountain sheep for hides to line their straw beds. The skins were smoked, dried, then spread out soft and warm. But over time, that rough material became a mark of class. The bigger, rarer, and finer the fur, the higher the status. Just as people today show off luxury cars or watches, the medieval elite flaunted bear pelts. In castles, a noble's bed was incomplete without at least one animal hide. In northern Europe, bears were the most prized thick fur, unmatched insulation. A full-grown bear pelt could cover an entire bed, its black fur shining like velvet, beautiful and commanding. People believed sleeping under a bearskin meant sleeping under strength itself. Only those brave enough to face wild beasts were worthy of being sheltered by the bear. Wolf fur carried a different meaning, pride and vigilance. The wolf was cunning, proud, and forever tied to warriors and hunters. Many knights preferred wolf pelts to bear, believing that wolf's hair guards the soul from evil. Some even kept the wolf's head attached, placing it at the foot of the bed as a talisman. The sight of a nobleman lying beneath silver-grey fur, bathed in torchlight, was both majestic and savage, enough to make any visitor bow their head. Deer hides were another favourite symbols of grace and purity. The fur was soft, smooth, in shades of golden brown or cream, warm yet elegant. Noble ladies adored deerskin because it was as gentle as human touch. They laid it over wool blankets, topped with white linen, turning their beds into portraits of feminine power and tenderness. In the richest castles, people collected furs like treasures: snow, leopard, white fox, red stag, even lion pelts from the south. Each came with a story, a meaning. When guests arrived, servants would proudly announce, "This one is from the northern forest, that one from the western plains." Each hide was a trophy. Some owners had never hunted a day in their lives but still boasted, "I slew this bear myself," when in truth they bought it from traders. Because fur became a symbol of prestige, it was treated like a sacred relic. Servants were tasked with brushing it every morning, lightly smoking it to keep out damp, and were forbidden from sitting on it. Only the master could touch it at night. In some families, furs were passed down through generations, like beds or blankets. People believed an ancestor's bearskin carried the warmth of their blood, helping descendants survive future winters. Of course, the reality wasn't always romantic. Poorly cured hides carried a stench, blood, smoke, earth. To us today it would be unpleasant, but to medieval people it was the smell of life. In cold stone rooms, the scent of fur reminded them of fire, of the forest, of living creatures that had once fought the same cold they now faced. A monk once wrote in a 14th century chronicle, "He who sleeps upon fur borrows the warmth of nature. Every hair is a prayer for survival." It sounds poetic, but it was true. On cold nights, when wind roared beyond the walls, Anyone lying beneath a bear pelt could feel the thick hair pressing against their skin, holding in every precious trace of body heat. And, of course, there were always stories to laugh at. One noble loved his bearskin so much he slept with the head still attached. A servant recalled he slept peacefully until midnight, then shouted, "It's biting me," and leapt up. He dreamed the bear came back to life. After that, he ordered the head removed, but kept the claws. "They look more intimidating," he said. Another lady adored wolf fur so much she had a nightgown made from it. But wolf hair is coarse, it scratched her skin like needles, forcing her to tear it off mid-sleep. The next morning, she declared, "It hurts, but I looked powerful." That was the spirit of the age, beauty, strength and warmth, all tangled together, blurring the line between survival and luxury. Not everyone approved. Some monks condemned fur as sinful, a symbol of man's cruelty. They urged believers to sleep only in linen and wool, so the soul may rest lighter. But outside the monasteries, in nights below freezing, such sermons meant nothing. Out there, death by cold was only one thin blanket away. And so, as the fires dimmed and the night deepened, the same familiar scene returned. A great lord curled under a bear pelt, his breath fogging in the air. Beside him, his lady draped in deerskin, lavender mingling with the scent of hide. Below them, servants sharing a fox blanket, straw rustling beneath. All of them high and low alike lying in the arms of the forest, in the breath of beasts, wrapped in the most ancient warmth humanity ever knew. In the cold stone room of the castle, the last torch flickered out, leaving only the faint glow of firelight shimmering on the animal hides draped across the bed. They said that was the warmth of the forest, the wild life force, tamed by human hands to fight the white death of winter. But if you stepped closer, breathed in deeply, you'd notice something beneath that warmth. A scent raw and real, both unpleasant and intoxicating. The tang of blood, the musk of earth, the smoke of fire, and the faint trace of life once living. The smell of fur was something no noble could escape. No matter how much it was smoked, rinsed in river water, or steeped in herbs, it remained the memory of the forest that refused to fade. Those who slept beneath bear, wolf, or deer hides all described the same experience. At first heavy, then warm, then slowly, the scent spread through the room, seeping into breath, into hair, into blankets, into skin. At first, many found it revolting. Ladies used to lavender and rosewater complained that it smelled like a dead forest. But when night fell and the wind howled outside, they pulled the covers tighter and accepted the scent as part of being alive, because that raw, animal odor somehow comforted them, as if a great beast were lying beside them, guarding them from the dark. Some said, the smell of fur is the smell of strength. It reminded people that, even in stone castles, they were still just creatures trying to survive in nature's world. The hide was the last bridge between man and forest, between civilization and instinct. When they drew the pelt close, they could feel the coarse hairs brushing their skin, hear the faint rustle as they moved, and for a moment, cold, fear, and human pride melted into one. In records from the 14th century, servants were given exact instructions on how to soften the scent of hides before nightfall. They burned bay leaves, rosemary, or placed dried orange peels around the bed to mask the wild smell. Some used cedarwood smoke, it kept out dampness, and added a sweet wooden note. But no matter how much they smoked or perfumed, the forest always won. Its scent lingered the breath of nature, trapped within stone walls. For peasants, the smell of fur was nothing new. They lived among the scents of earth, straw, and smoke. They didn't mind. In fact, they found it comforting. The smell of fur felt safe, like being held by the woods. Many winter-born children were wrapped in rabbit or sheepskin. Their mothers said, "The forest holds warmth better than cloth." And they were right. The scent of the forest was the scent of survival. For nobles, it was ironic they had to relearn how to love the wild smell their ancestors once lived with. Amid silk, perfume, and polished wood, the scent of fur stood out as a reminder. You may wear armor, you may wear a crown, but you are still a creature afraid of the cold, living only because another creature's skin covers you. In the long nights, when the fire went out, people curled beneath their furs. The smell crept into dreams, sometimes turning into nightmares. Some dreamed of forests, of growling bears, of wolves howling, of losing their way in blizzards. Others woke drenched in sweat, half terrified, half longing. They said the hide carried the beast's soul, and if you slept too deeply, you could hear its breath. Naturally, legends grew around that scent of the wild. One told of a countess who loved a hunter. When he died in the forest, she took the bear hide he'd once claimed, stitched it into a blanket, and each night swore she heard his heartbeat beneath it. Servants said that when she died, they buried her, wrapped in that same fur, for no one dared separate them. Ever since, they claimed, when winter came, you could still hear soft sighs in her old chamber, the scent of fur and love blending into one. Yet beyond these tales, the wild scent carried a deeper truth. It was a memory of survival preserved across millennia. Everyone who slept beneath a hide felt the same faint emotion. Something savage yet safe. It was the ancient instinct we could never erase, even after we built walls and wore clothes. When people pulled their fur blankets close, they weren't just seeking warmth, they were reaching back toward nature itself. Even travelers crossing the frozen mountains carried small scraps of fur not to show off, but to carry the breath of the forest. They believed the scent kept away evil and steadied the mind. In parts of northern Europe, monks even draped wolf pelts over coffins not for luxury, but because they believed the wolf would guide the soul through the eternal winter beyond. The smell of fur, then, went beyond the senses. It became the language of life itself. Every breath drawn from it was a breath of history, the scent of storms, of hot blood in freezing air, of mankind's endless struggle with the wild. In the medieval world, where everything had a hierarchy from the cup you drank from to the cloak you wore, even the fur blanket on your bed declared who you were. Not everyone had the right to sleep beneath a bear. Not everyone was worthy of wolf fur. And if you were an ordinary person, you would never touch deerskin, the symbol of noble blood. Back then, the type of fur on your bed was your calling card. No one needed to ask your rank. One glance at the colour of the pelt told them everything. Bear fur, for example, was the choice of powerful men, warriors and lords. The bear was king of the forest, a symbol of strength, courage, and survival through the cruelest winters. A great bear hide, dark brown or glossy black, spread across a bed wasn't just for warmth. It was a mantle of honour. Whoever slept beneath it declared, "I am as strong as this beast. The forest once bowed to me, now it serves me." But bears were not easy prey. Only the most seasoned hunters or battle-hardened knights dared face them. So if someone had a real bear blanket in their room, everyone knew that person had either fought in wars or held a title high enough to send others to do the hunting. Some lords even kept the bear's head attached, set at the foot of the bed like a warning. The sight was striking: a dark room, torchlight glinting on black fur, a gaping bear's mouth, white fangs bared. Sleep surrounded by power and danger that was the image of nobility. If the bear stood for strength, the wolf stood for authority and cunning. The wolf wasn't as strong as the bear, but far sharper, ever watchful, bound by pact loyalty. That's why wolf hides were favoured by knights, counts, and leaders who admired the symbol of leadership. A silver-grey wolf pelt on the bed brought both warmth and a cold elegance. People believed sleeping beneath it warded off nightmares, kept the mind sharp, and let the soul wake in the dark. In parts of northern Europe, wolf fur was also believed to repel evil. Children born in winter were sometimes wrapped in small wolf skins to keep the forest spirits away. For knights, sleeping under wolf fur wasn't just comfort, it was a ritual of honour. After battle, they often kept a piece of wolf fur as a trophy, laying it across their bed as proof of victory. Many noble letters mention the gift of a wolf pelt as a gesture of respect. One count once wrote to his friend, "You sent me the northern wolf hide. I cherish it as a gift from a wise man. Tonight, I sleep in the breath of the forest." And it wasn't just men. Noble women had their own ways of showing status through fur. Ladies of high rank often chose deerskin, soft, light, and golden beige. In European culture, the deer was tied to beauty, purity, and grace. Deer fur lacked the heavy smell of bear, the roughness of wolf, and had a natural smoothness that felt like warm silk. It became known as the blanket of the noble-hearted. A countess in Burgundy once wrote in her diary, "I will not sleep under bear, for it makes me dream of blood, nor under wolf, for I hear its howls in the wind." But deerskin is different. It is spring's dream in the heart of winter. That line became famous, quoted for centuries as proof that even bedding in the Middle Ages reflected one's soul and nature. And like everything else in a class-bound world, fur had its own hierarchy. Bear power, strength, honour for lords, knights and kings. Wolf authority, vigilance, intellect for commanders, nobles and men of war. Deer elegance, purity, refinement for noble women, duchesses and high-born nuns. Fox and rabbit middle class. Merchants, senior servants warm but not grand. Sheep the most common. For common folk plain, warm, cheap and easy to find. Each fur mirrored the status of the sleeper beneath it. Even under the same castle roof, the warmth one was allowed to touch carried the mark of rank. Servants could see the bear hide but only touch the sheep's wool. During festivals, the finest furs were hung on walls for guests to admire power displayed through heat. There were even famous disputes over blankets. Records from Champagne in 1386 tell of two noble brothers who sued each other for the right to inherit their father's bear hide. Both claimed that whoever slept beneath that fur was the rightful heir to the family's legacy. In the end, they cut the hide in half and neither slept warm again. The story became a folk saying, "He who splits the bear ends with half its warmth." People repeated it as a reminder that power grows cold when we forget the true meaning of those furs, not to boast, but to survive. Nothing reveals the true nature of medieval people more clearly than this. They could spill blood over a bear pelt. In a world where everything was tied to honour, rank and belief, even a blanket could become a symbol of power. And the most famous story of all, recorded in the Chronicles of Champagne, France, in the 14th century, tells of two noble brothers, sons of a lord, who turned their father's legacy into a fire of hatred, all because of a bear skin. Their father, Count Roland de Montclair, was a fearsome warrior of the Northern Crusades. He once single-handedly killed a giant bear deep in the frozen woods and brought its hide back to his castle. From that day, the pelt became the symbol of the Montclair name, a mark of strength and courage for the entire bloodline. Every winter, the bearskin was spread across the Count's bed. Every summer, it hung on the main hall wall like a shield. People in the region called it the breath of the northern forest. When the Count died, he left behind two sons, Armand, the elder calm but ambitious, and Lucien, the younger, fiery and emotional. In his will, their father wrote, "The bearskin shall belong to the one worthy of keeping the blood of Montclair warm." But he never said which one that was. And so, it began. During the funeral, as the servants packed up their master's belongings, Armand ordered the pelt brought to his room, claiming, "The eldest inherits the name." But Lucien refused, saying, "I am the one who takes after father, the one who dares to hunt." Inside that cold room full of mourners, the brothers began to argue not over land or gold, but over the silent pelt lying at the foot of the bed, as if watching its own tragedy unfold. Servants later said they heard shouting that night, furniture breaking, voices echoing through the halls. When they rushed in, the two nobles were wrestling for the hide, fur flying through the air like snow. Armand shouted, "You don't understand, this isn't a blanket. It's the honour of Montclair." Lucien yelled back, "If honour is just a dead skin, then I'll bury it with father." The servants tried to intervene, but it was too late. The hide tore one long rip, splitting it in two, just like the bloodline itself. The next morning the castle buzzed with whispers. Armand kept the top half, the bear's head. Lucien took the bottom, the legs and tail. The two brothers lived under the same roof but never spoke again. Each guarded his half like a sacred relic, half of the power, half of the soul. That winter came early. The castle was colder than ever, wind whistling through the cracks, frost climbing the stone walls. They said Armand still laid his half on the bed but slept poorly, claiming he heard the bear growl each night. Lucien kept his half in the wine cellar, under his bed, afraid it was watching him. Both held a peace, and neither was warm. The story spread through the countryside. Villagers whispered it by their firesides, and children sang a mocking rhyme. Two brothers fought for the bear's breath. Winter laughed through castle halls. One kept the head, one kept the tail. The bear is gone, only cold remains. Then, one snowy night, the Montclair castle caught fire. No one knew how it started. By morning, it was ash. Among the ruins, they found 2 bodies lying side by side, and between them, the bear skin, burned but whole again. The old folks said, "The bear returned to the forest, taking Roland's sons with it." From then on, the tale became a warning. No one dared fight over furs anymore, not out of fear of bears, but of the cost of pride. In Champagne, people began to say, "Split the bear, and the warmth dies," a saying that sounded like philosophy, but perfectly captured the tragedy of that age, a time when even warmth could become a symbol of power. Of course, the Montclair legend changed with every retelling. Some said Armand survived, repented, and sewed the hide back together, hanging it in a chapel as penance. Others claimed Lucien lived, lighting incense each winter and speaking to the spirit of Father's bear. But whichever version you hear, the meaning stays the same. That hide held not just warmth, it held human pride. And if you travel to Champagne today, in some old villages you'll still hear a proverb: "The bear's warmth belongs only to those who share it." They say when the cold wind blows through the forest, you can still hear the deep, rumbling laugh of the Montclair bear. Not an animal's roar, but the echo of men realizing how foolish they were to fight over something that could only stay warm if held together. That story, after hundreds of years, is still told on long winter nights, not as tragedy, but as a gentle reminder. Never let the cold inside you be colder than the winter outside. The stories of bear pelts, straw beds, and long frozen nights may sound like legends woven by a storyteller's imagination. Yet centuries later, when archaeologists began to unearth the real ruins of Europe's castles, they discovered something that left the academic world in stunned silence. Everything the old tales described was true. From England and France to Germany and Scandinavia, excavation teams uncovered material traces that proved what we know about medieval winters wasn't folklore at all, but fact. Beneath the damp layers of old fortresses, they found hardened scraps of animal hide, charred wool fibres, and even straw impressions still etched into stone floors, silent witnesses of centuries spent warming themselves through pure instinct. At Dover Castle in England, one of the most striking discoveries came in 1973. Beneath the bedroom floor of the Great Hall, archaeologists found a thick layer of straw mixed with ash and animal fur. Analysis showed it was wheat straw and sheep's wool from the Kent region. Experts concluded that people had spread straw for insulation, then laid furs on top, creating a kind of warm floor bed for winter nights. In Germany, at the ruins of the old Hohenzollern castle, dozens of dark brown animal hide fragments were found crushed beneath fallen stone. Carbon dating revealed they were over 600 years old. DNA analysis identified bear, wolf, and deer, exactly the animals mentioned in medieval chronicles. Even more astonishing, traces of animal fat and soot were still present, proving the hides had been smoke-cured just as written sources once described. In France, at Mont-Saint-Michel, archaeologists uncovered singed clumps of wool and a piece of coarse linen tucked in a corner of an old cellar. Under the microscope, the linen fibres showed uneven hand-twisting, typical of 13th century weaving. Researchers believe it belonged to a monk's bedding from the abbey. One scholar wrote, "The smell of damp earth mixed with decayed linen makes you feel as if you could touch the sleep of the dead." And it wasn't just castles. In medieval villages, discoveries told the same story. At Warmest in England, one of the best preserved medieval settlements, investigators found house floors lined with straw, hearth ash, and shards of pottery coated with tallow. This proved villagers rubbed sheep or ox fat into wool blankets to waterproof and strengthen them. Some surviving bed frames were so small they could only fit one curled-up person, matching old descriptions that called them coffin beds, just big enough to hold one's warmth. Scientists even found pollen and dried herbs trapped in the wall plaster, lavender, mint, and rosemary, showing people once scattered fragrant plants in their sleeping rooms. The smells of grass, wool, and fur once described by storytellers weren't poetic inventions. They were historical reality, preserved in dust. Another remarkable find came from Scandinavia. In Sweden, at the ruins of Bohus Fortress, a nearly intact bear pelt was found buried beneath layers of heating ash. Isotope testing revealed the bear had lived in northern forests over 300 kilometers away, proving furs were transported long distances, luxury goods of their age. It also confirmed what history hinted at, that medieval nobles flaunted not only silk and gold, but the origin of their furs. A hide from the northern forests was a badge of glory. In Italy, archaeologists in Tuscany uncovered a small storage cellar containing scraps of parchment with a servant's inventory list of winter laundry. In Latin, it read, 2 bear hides, 3 wool blankets, 4 linen sheets, smoke twice each week. A simple line, but living proof of the old practice of preserving furs with smoke once dismissed as myth. Now, science confirms it, every detail, from the old tales, the washing, the smoking, the layering, was real. These discoveries forced historians to rethink medieval luxury. Behind those thick stone walls and heavy beds, life was far from comfortable. Even in palaces, survival was a quiet struggle against the cold. And when those ancient hides were lifted from the earth, it was as if the wind of the past whispered again the same wind that once crept into the beds of kings and peasants alike. A young German archaeologist once said at a press conference, "When I held that charred piece of hide in my hands, I realized the person who slept on it wasn't so different from us. They shivered. They feared the cold. They wished for one peaceful night." Science, bones, and artifacts now speak what literature once only murmured. Medieval people fought not just with swords and armor, but with blankets, with straw, with every breath of warmth they could keep. And so, amid the ruins of time among the rotted wood and ashes, we still find traces of heat, traces of hands smoothing blankets, of breath caught in wool fibers, of short sleeps through long winters. The hides and straw, though lifeless, are silent witnesses telling the truest story of all, that humans once froze, once feared, but never stopped trying to stay warm. In the medieval world, when everything around you was cold, the walls cold, the floors cold, the wind cold, even the bed-cold fire was the only thing that stayed warm. It wasn't just light, it was the soul of the room, the boundary between life and darkness. Without fire, no matter how vast the castle, it was nothing but a tomb of stone. Imagine an evening in the bedchamber of a count. Thick tapestries hang on the walls, straw covers the floor, yet nothing can truly stop the wind whistling through the cracks. In the corner, a small stone fireplace burns a weak golden flame, licking the last log, its flicker dancing on the wall, making the whole room seem to breathe. A servant kneels silently beside it, feeding one stick at a time, eyes red from the smoke. Fire did more than warm the body, it kept the spirit alive. In an age when darkness was the greatest fear, the glow of fire was a promise that you are still alive. So, whether rich or poor, everyone tried to keep a flame in the hearth, in the oven, in small braziers set beside their beds. Servants called it the fire of God, because when it went out, the night belonged to demons, to wind, and to death by cold. But keeping it alive was no easy task. Castles were built of stone, thick but damp, and the fire burned out fast. Each night, servants had to guard it carefully. In some places, they stayed awake in shifts, adding logs through the long hours. One mistake forgetting the wood, or letting the draught blow in, and the room would freeze within minutes. By morning, the sleepers' breath would frost on their blankets. And yet fire was a luxury. In winter, wood was as precious as gold. Every log was labor chopped, split, dried, and carried. A nobleman might own hundreds of acres, yet still fear running out of fuel. Records describe servants walking half a day just to gather a few dry branches. So, fire was used sparingly, almost ceremonially. No flame was wasted. Everyone had a purpose. One for the kitchen, one for the great hall, one for the bedchamber. The bedroom fire, small as it was, carried sacred meaning. People believed that each flame holds a soul. Before sleeping, the master would look into the fire and whisper, "Keep my warmth until morning." Then the servant would tamp the embers down, leaving them to smoulder through the night, saving wood, but keeping life. The crackling of coals became the heartbeat of the room, and the flicker of light made the stone walls seem to move, to live. On some nights, that fragile fire was the only thing keeping people sane. When the wind howled through the doors and snow hammered the bars, they stared into the flame and felt safe. A monk once wrote, "I look at the fire and see the face of God. I look into the dark and see the devil. Fire is the grace that keeps us from despair." And truly, During those endless winters when daylight lasted only a few hours, fire was life itself. When children were afraid, people told them, "Sit by the fire, the spirits won't come near." When the sick were dying, they placed a brazier beside the bed, for the soul needs light to leave. And when someone passed away, the servant would extinguish the fire in their room, snuffing out the last warmth of a life. Perhaps that's why fire wasn't merely physical, but spiritual. It reminded people that amid stone, wind, and ice, there was still something warm, alive, and beautiful. A small, fragile flame, yet strong enough to push back an entire winter. If you've ever stood inside the ruins of an old castle and looked into an ancient hearth, you can almost see it. Someone once knelt there, kindling a spark, breathing into their frozen hands, believing that as long as that fire burned, they would survive the night. For in a world without electricity, without stoves, without sealed chimneys, the flame was the only heartbeat left in a room of stone. And when it died, the castle stopped breathing too. Before stone castles ever rose, medieval people already knew fire, but they hadn't yet learned how to keep it. In the earliest homes, the hearth was nothing more than a bare pile of embers set in the middle of the floor. Smoke drifted upward, filling the entire room, clinging to the walls and the ceiling until everything turned black. People had to crouch low and squint through the haze, but they accepted it, because back then, suffocation was still better than freezing. Over time, those open hearths evolved into what was called the central fire. Instead of letting smoke wander everywhere, builders carved a hole in the roof called an eyrie, meaning the eye of the house. The fire burned below, smoke coiling upward before escaping through that single hole. On winter nights, if you stood outside and looked up, you'd see columns of smoke rising straight into the sky, signs of life. In that world, a house without smoke was a house cold and dead. But the open hearth had its flaws. It took up space and never stopped the smoke. Every room stayed veiled in a thin fog of ash, the smell soaked into fabric and hair. Old castles like Chepstow in England or Coucy in France still bear black soot stains on their ceilings, proof of those centuries before humans learned to tame warmth. Then came the 12th century, and with it, the wall fireplace, a small invention that changed how Europeans lived. Instead of fire in the middle of the room, they built stone recesses into the walls, channeling smoke through a chimney straight up to the roof. It sounds simple now, but at the time, it was revolutionary. For the first time, people could be warm and breathe clean air at the same time. And more than that, they could have fire in separate rooms. From then on, the fireplace wasn't just a tool. It became the heart of the home. The wall above it was often beautifully decorated, carved with flowers, lions, or even family crests. The hearth became a family symbol, the place where everyone gathered, where servants said evening prayers, where nobles warmed their hands after long feasts. The French called the fireplace cheminée, from the word meaning path, a path through which warmth travelled across cold walls, and also a path that brought people together. Of course, not everyone had that privilege. Fireplaces were reserved for the powerful kings, counts, bishops. The poor still slept beside open fires, sharing smoke with their livestock. In Scandinavia, people even kept cattle inside the same house to share warmth. It was smoky, but it was warm. Meanwhile, nobles slept in private chambers with marble fireplaces carved in elegant patterns. On the mantel, they placed candles, silver cups, or holy icons like a small altar to warmth itself. Yet even the finest hearths of the age were crude. Chimneys had no caps, so wind often blew smoke back into the room. Logs burned too quickly, ash scattered everywhere, and a strong gust could snuff out the fire in seconds. That's why servants had to tend the flame all night long. In great castles there was even a title for it: Firekeeper, the keeper of fire. They didn't just light it, they understood it, which wood burned slow, which smoked too much, when to add coal, when to open the flue for air. A good firekeeper could save an entire household from freezing to death. Records even say that lords chose where to sleep based on the fireplace's position. No one wanted to lie too far from the hearth wall. Heat only spread a few steps before the cold took over again, so beds were angled slightly toward the fire, close enough to feel warmth, far enough to avoid the smoke. And because of that, the glow of the hearth found its way into poetry, a symbol of comfort in the loneliness of night. A 14th century manuscript from Canterbury Abbey wrote, "We fear not the dark, for in the hearth still glows red coal. Each flame is a soul, and God breathes his warmth through them all." Today, when you stand before an ancient fireplace in a European museum, you can still see the soot clinging to its walls, the stones worn smooth by centuries of flame. They are not just traces of early engineering, they are the fossils of the first warmth humanity ever won from the world of stone. It took the medieval world hundreds of years to master the art of lighting fires, building hearths, and controlling smoke. But no matter how skilled they became, the cold still won. The blazing fire inside a grand fireplace only spread warmth in a small circle, a tiny island of heat in an endless ocean of stone and wind. Just a few steps away, the temperature dropped almost to the chill of the open air. Picture yourself standing inside a medieval great hall. Walls towering over 30 feet high, a vaulted stone ceiling, windows as narrow as arrow slits. In the center stands a fireplace large enough to roast an entire pig. Logs crackle, sparks burst like stars, and smoke coils into the black chimney. You stretch your hands forward, the heat roars against your skin, but take just a few steps back, and the cold slips down your collar. The room divides itself in two, half a blazing inferno, half a frozen silence. Those thick stone walls were built to withstand siege, block arrows, and protect their lord. But the same walls that kept enemies out trapped the cold within. When frost set in, the stone absorbed all the warmth, then slowly breathed the chill back into the room. Even if the fire burned all night, you could still see frost on the doorknob and ice forming in the cup beside the bed. People used to say, "A castle is the largest refrigerator in Europe." They weren't wrong. Even kings and queens suffered the same fate. In 1253, Queen Eleanor of Provence wrote in her diary, "The fire burned all night in my chamber, yet in the morning I still saw my breath. This whole kingdom lives within stone." The cold wasn't just harsh, it was uneven. Sit before the hearth, and your face burned while your back froze. The heat didn't spread like it does today, because there were no metal reflectors or vents. The fire only warmed the air right next to it, forcing people to crowd close, their faces flushed, their legs numb. Servants wrote that after feasts, nobles would take turns rotating around the fire, like moons circling the sun, so everyone could have a moment of warmth. As night fell, the fireplace cooled. The logs burned out, embers dimmed. Servants dared not add more wood, afraid of sparks catching the blankets or smoke suffocating the room. The chill returned quickly, and those sleeping far from the hearth, noble or knight, curled up and pulled their fur covers tight around their necks. Some even moved their beds so close that smoke stained their clothes. But it was better than freezing. One countess once wrote, "I sleep beside the fire and dream that I am burning, yet I still cannot move away." People tried everything to trap heat indoors, hanging thick tapestries on the walls, draping velvet curtains over doors, spreading straw across floors, even laying ox hides on roofs to block the wind. But all of it was like patching a coat in a blizzard. Warmth escaped as quickly as breath. The wealthy could afford to burn more wood, but logs, coal, and oil were expensive. One warm night could mean an entire forest burned. A famous story tells that King Henry II of England once ordered all the trees around Windsor Castle cut down to save the palace from freezing. After 3 months, the woods were gone and the castle was still cold. The chronicler wrote dryly, "The king conquered the forest but lost to the winter." The chill inside a castle wasn't like the cold outdoors. It was silent and stubborn, creeping through every stone and crack. Those who lived within could hear the wind howling through chimneys, the iron grating, shivering, and sometimes the wooden beams snapping from the frost. Those sounds made people feel small, fragile, as if they lived inside the mouth of a great stone beast. And so, they began to believe that the hearth wasn't just a tool, but a guardian spirit. Each evening, when the fire was lit, the servants would whisper a prayer. "Let this flame burn warm enough to last the night." The red glow danced across the walls, light flickering like souls, while outside, the snow kept falling. The entire castle became a lonely heart beating in a sea of ice. And perhaps it was that helplessness, the smallness of flame against an endless winter, that taught medieval people one simple truth. Warmth was never in the fire. It was in each other. When medieval people realized their fireplaces could never warm an entire room, they began trying to trick the winter. They couldn't change the wind, they couldn't soften the stone, but they could redirect the warmth, and so strange, clever, sometimes hilarious inventions were born. From freezing monasteries to lavish palaces, the minds of that age came up with countless ways to keep the heat in. And though many of their methods seem crude, even absurd, to modern eyes, they carried within them the desperate intelligence of humans cornered by cold. 1. Heat-reflecting mirrors, the first magic of warmth. In 14th century France, wealthy nobles began hanging polished metal mirrors behind their fireplaces, not for vanity, but to reflect the firelight around the room. When the flames burned, the reflections made the space look brighter, warmer, almost alive. Of course, mirrors back then weren't glass like ours, but sheets of bronze or silver polished to a dull shimmer, reflecting light like ripples on water. Yet to medieval people, that faint glow felt like fire multiplying its soul. Some believed mirrors held the spirit of the flame, so they never turned them away from the hearth. The more superstitious claimed that if you looked into one while the fire burned, you might glimpse the spirit of heat smiling back. 2. Angled stone walls, the ancient art of heat direction. Medieval architects, especially in England and Germany, noticed that fireplace heat spread diagonally, not evenly. So they designed slanted interior walls that leaned slightly inward, bouncing the warmth back into the room. These walls could be nearly a meter thick, hollow inside, trapping heat that slowly radiated out long after the fire died. Modern infrared scans have confirmed it. Castles like Bodiam in England and Hohenzollern in Germany really did have those thermal walls. They weren't enough to make a room warm, but they could raise the temperature by a few degrees, just enough to save someone from freezing. It was humanity's first experiment in manual thermodynamics, a science born not from books, but from the instinct to survive. 3. The night firekeepers, silent souls of the cold. Without machines, without smokeless fuel, the only way to keep the fire alive was to stay awake. In every castle, at least one servant was assigned to guard the flame all night, usually a young page or a criminal earning redemption. They sat beside the hearth, forbidden to let the fire die. If it dimmed, they had to stir the coals, relight the logs, or sneak wood from storage. A single mistake could mean harsh punishment. In some places, the guilty had their hands plunged into icy water. In others, they were made to sleep outside to remember the price of cold. But most didn't need punishment, because if they nodded off for even a few minutes, the chill itself would wake them. They say that in Windsor Castle, a young firekeeper named Edmund died slumped by the hearth in 1278. When they found him, the ashes were still warm. The story spread across Europe, a symbol of quiet loyalty. The keeper died, but the fire still burned. 4. Other strange tricks, creativity and desperation. Some nobles placed copper bowls filled with water or wine around the hearth, letting the steam moisten the air to prevent cracked lips and dry skin. Others hung salted animal hides near the chimney to trap heat. The Italians were even more inventive. They heated clay bricks in the fire, wrapped them in wool, and slid them under the bed. Cheap, effective, and centuries later, this would evolve into the first hot water bottle. In Northern Europe, people built double-layered walls stuffed with dry straw or horse manure for insulation. It sounds revolting, but it worked. In the records of the Nidaros monastery in Norway, one line reads, "Horse straw has saved more souls than the Holy Cross." These inventions, from the dim mirror to the slanted wall, from the shivering firekeeper to the humble brick under the bed, all prove one thing. Humanity never bows to the cold. They had no science, no electricity, only wit, and the will to survive. A blazing fire in a noble's hearth didn't just radiate warmth. It radiated power, status, and the blood of the forest. Because to keep a castle bright and warm, sometimes an entire forest had to burn each year. It sounds exaggerated, but it was a harsh truth. A single grand fireplace could consume nearly half a ton of wood per day. In a castle with dozens of rooms and hundreds of people living and working inside, the amount of wood needed was unimaginable. Records from 13th century England wrote, "A fortress requires at least 60 cartloads of firewood each week to survive the winter. Each cart was stacked high with oak, ash, or pine trees that took decades to grow back. That's why owning your own forest became the mark of a true noble. No forest meant no firewood, which meant no warmth, and without warmth there was no life. Lords treated their forests as sacred property, forbidding peasants to cut even a fallen branch. Anyone caught stealing could be whipped, or worse, have their hand cut off. In some places, the woods around a castle were called God's fire chamber. A servant wrote in his 14th century diary, "Every log thrown into the fire is a bone of the forest. I can hear the trees weep in the crackling flames." Those simple, haunting words showed that even then, people knew they were killing nature to survive. Not just in palaces, but in monasteries and villages too. The fear of running out of wood haunted everyone. Monks made strict rules. No fire shall be lit by day, except for the sick or on holy feasts. Farmers saved every scrap gathering roots, thorny branches, even dried dung and peat to burn. In Ireland and Scotland, peat mud pressed for centuries in marshes became the poor man's wood. It burned slowly, smelled harsh, smoked thickly, but it was warm and cheap. Meanwhile, in castles, oak logs fragrant, slow-burning, low smoke, were reserved for the noble class. The difference was clear as class itself. The poor burned straw and dung. The monks burned peat, the craftsmen burned scrap wood, and the nobles burned forests. Some regions were completely devastated by the castle's hunger for fire. In Burgundy, France, a 1,315 record states, the woods around the stronghold were stripped bare after 3 winters. The wind carried ash all the way to the village. Many peasants had to abandon their homes because the empty plains left by deforestation turned to frozen wastelands. Yet behind castle walls, fires still blazed, reflected in polished armor and silver goblets. Firewood became a hidden luxury not just for heat, but as proof. I can burn forests and still live warm. Thus arose a strict system of firewood management. Every castle had a keeper of the firewood, an actual position recorded in English chronicles. Their duty was to count, distribute, and monitor every log. The wood was stacked in daily bundles, tied with hemp rope, sealed with the Lord's mark. Any servant caught burning too much faced harsh punishment because each piece of wood was worth its weight in coin. Even holiday fires carried symbolic meaning. During Christmas, people selected a massive log, the Yule log, and burned it in the main hall for 12 days straight. The longer it burned, the better. They believed its ashes brought luck and warmth for the coming year. Servants kept the embers and scattered them around the castle to ward off demons and cold. Yet behind that cheerful ritual lay a brutal truth: to find the lucky log. A team of men had to venture deep into the forest and fell a centuries-old tree. When it was gone, only white smoke drifted into the sky, and one more patch of forest stood empty. By the 15th century, as cities began to rise, the shortage of firewood became a true crisis. Prices soared, merchants hoarded, and commoners shivered. Some kings even passed laws limiting the number of fireplaces per home. Those who exceeded the limit were fined. But humanity has never accepted the cold. They kept burning. They kept destroying the forests, all for a few hours of warmth in the dark. In medieval castles, while their masters slept soundly between feather beds and velvet curtains, there were always those who stayed awake through the night beside the fire. They were not warriors, not nobles, but the keepers of warmth, the silent souls who guarded the castle's breath. Their names were never written in history, yet without them, no count or lady might have survived even their first winter. The work of a fire servant began when the sun went down. After supper ended, and the grand hall's main hearth was dimmed, only the small fireplaces in the Lord's chambers remained. The servant would carefully pick the driest wood, split it fine, and stack it in a crisscross pattern so the flames would burn evenly without spitting sparks. Then they would sit, watching the fire, not too strong, not too weak. It sounded simple, but it demanded patience and knowledge. If the fire burned too hot, the room would fill with smoke and choke the master awake. If it burned too low, the warmth would vanish within minutes, and the person in bed would wake shivering in the dark. Inside stone walls, the temperature could drop below freezing, and even a single draught through the door was enough to turn the bed to ice. So the servant guarded the heat, as if guarding a heartbeat. They sat right before the fireplace, wrapped in tattered blankets, clutching iron tongs. Their eyes burned red from the smoke, their lids heavy with exhaustion, yet they dared not close them. A moment's sleep, and the fire would die, and by morning they might be whipped for letting the Lord go cold. Some nights, the firekeeper had to tend more than one room. Every chamber had its own hearth. The master's, the banquet hall, the guest rooms, even the reception hall. The fire servant would go from room to room, adding wood, then circle back before the first flame dimmed. All night long they walked the halls a silent patrol through the dark. A servant's journal from Warwick Castle in 14th century England reads, "The 10th night of winter, I lit the fires 6 times and heard 12 bells. At first my fingers burned from the coals. By dawn I could no longer feel them. Some could not endure the cold and smoke. They died slumped by the hearth, like lamps running out of oil. They died quietly, unnoticed until morning came, and the fire was cold, and a stiff body lay beside the ashes. Yet others spent their whole lives in this duty, passing it down to their children. In some castles the title fire steward was handed down through 3 or 4 generations, a tradition of loyalty lived out in darkness. Many had small rituals before lighting the fire. Some whispered prayers, "Let this flame keep my master's soul warm." Others greeted it like an old friend, "We meet again." For to them, the fire was not just work, it was their only companion in the night. They learned to understand it the way one understands a breath. From the crack of a log, they knew when the wind had shifted. From the dimming of the coals, they knew when to add wood. From the smell of the smoke, they knew when the chimney was blocked and would rush to open a window before the room suffocated. They were ancient engineers of heat. No books, no training, only instinct and survival. One tale tells of a servant named Thomas in Winchester Palace. Each night, he entered the chamber of Countess Eleanor to add wood. One night, she awoke and saw him crouched by the fire, his wrinkled face glowing in the flame. She asked, "Thomas, do you never sleep?" He smiled and replied, "If I sleep, the fire will sleep too, my lady." The Countess said nothing more. The next morning, she ordered a thick cloak made for him. From then on, they called him the Sleepless One. That image, small yet profound, reflected the spirit of an age. People who lived in the cold, yet still kept others warm. The fire they tended did more than heat the stone walls. It kept humanity alive in a frozen world. Sometimes, the servants would simply sit and watch the fire, listening to the wind wailing outside, thinking, "Out there, the forest is burning for this warmth." Then they would lift the tongs again, feed the coals, pull the blanket tighter, and stay there until dawn's light crept through the narrow window and the morning bells began to ring. Between the thick, ice-cold stone walls, when the fire in the hearth could only warm a single corner of the room, medieval people came up with a small but miraculous invention. The brazier, a portable charcoal stove, the ancestor of the modern personal heater. It was so simple that today we might overlook it, but on a freezing night at -10 degrees Celsius, the brazier was nothing short of a miracle of survival. A brazier was usually a round copper or iron bowl, about the width of a hand, set on short legs with holes or a grate to let air flow through. Inside it burned glowing coals, often scooped from a larger hearth, covered with a thin layer of ash to make the heat last longer. Servants carried the brazier to place beside their master's bed, under a table, or in the middle of a small room. The embers glowed for hours, giving off a gentle warmth, not blazing like wood fire, but steady, soft, and silent. People called it by many names. In France, braziero. In Italy, scaldino. In England, braziera. But they all meant the same thing: the fire in your hands. It was the little stove that saved countless lives from the biting cold, especially those who had to stay awake through the night, servants, monks, and guards. The refined nobles used braziers to warm their beds before sleeping. Servants would slip one under the fur blankets for a few minutes, then remove it right before their master lay down, leaving behind a faint trace of warmth in the sheets. In monasteries, nuns used small bowl-sized braziers under their desks as they prayed. Scholars, who spent long nights copying manuscripts in unheated rooms, kept braziers by their feet to keep the ink from freezing. A 14th century Italian scholar once wrote, "Without this little stove, my words would stop flowing like blood turned to ice in my veins." Yet the comfort of the brazier came with deadly danger. Because it was small and enclosed, the slow-burning coals released carbon monoxide, colourless, odourless, and deadly in silence. Many died in their sleep from keeping the brazier too close to the bed. A record from 15th century Florence told of a merchant and his wife found the next morning, still holding hands beneath the blanket, their cheeks pink as if asleep, but neither breathed again. People called it the death of a warm winter, poetic, but haunting. Still, that danger never stopped people from using it. In a world that cold, freezing to death, was far more terrifying than dying of smoke. Servants learned to master the brazier as a skill. They knew which charcoal to use, how thick the ash should be, how far to place it from the bed, and most importantly to keep a window slightly cracked to let the air escape. A skilled servant could keep the coals glowing all night without smoke. Their reward at the end of winter wasn't gold, but a night's sleep beside the main fireplace. The brazier was also a symbol of closeness and sharing. In the great freezing halls, people would sit together around that little stove, warming their hands, telling stories, drinking wine. A French saying of the time went, "No one can lie beside the embers." Perhaps because when people share one small source of warmth, their hearts soften, their words grow honest, and smiles come easier. In Italy, there was even a strange custom. Young women would bring a brazier to the house of the man they loved, a silent confession. If he accepted it and placed it beside him, it meant yes. If he let the coals burn out, it meant the love had gone cold. The saying, "Il fuoco della mano e il fuoco dell'amor," the fire in your hands is the fire in your heart, came from that very ritual. And perhaps the brazier was more than a stove. It was a symbol of the human spirit itself, small, fragile, yet able to carry fire. In a world of stone, people made their own warmth within arm's reach, enough to heat their feet, their hearts, and keep a spark of humanity alive through endless winters. Today, when we look at old paintings of braziers, the red glow in a smoky room, that faces gathered around it, we can understand why they cherished it so deeply. Because in that age, nothing was more sacred than a little warmth. A copper bowl, a few coals, and human persistence, those were what kept Europe alive through centuries of deadly winters, so that it could endure to this very day. Fire could save lives, but it could also kill, and in medieval castles death by warmth was far from rare. In the heart of winter, when wind howled through stone walls and snow-blanketed rooftops, everyone knew that glowing embers and crackling fires could bring danger. Yet they still burned them, still clung to them like addicts who couldn't let go of the very thing that hurt them. Braziers, fireplaces, charcoal all released carbon monoxide, an invisible, scentless poison. In closed rooms where windows were sealed tight against the wind, one careless night was all it took for death to come softly, like sleep. There was no screaming, no struggle, just a slow drowsiness, eyelids falling, hearts stopping, and by morning they were found with peaceful faces, as if dreaming of a spring that never came. Chronicles from 14th century England and France are filled with such accounts. In the monastery of York, in 1381, 4 monks slept together in a small room, keeping a brazier burning through the night. The next morning, when the servant came to ring the prayer bell, he found them still in their beds, dead from carbon monoxide poisoning. The story spread across the region, becoming a grim lesson about the price of warmth. But many deaths came not from fumes, but from fire itself. Blankets, curtains, rugs, everything was flammable. A single spark, a stray coal rolling from a brazier, could turn a bedroom into hell in minutes. A French chronicle told how, in 1320, the wife of the Count of Clermont woke in the night to find her wool blanket smoking from a brazier placed too close. In panic, she pulled the blanket over it, trapping the air and causing the flames to roar up. By the time servants broke down the door, only ashes remained and the smell of burned wool. After that, castles issued a rule: no fire shall sleep beside noble blood. But rules were one thing, reality another. Everyone disobeyed them, because in that skin-cutting cold, people were willing to risk everything. They said, if death comes in a warm sleep, it is a merciful death. A nun named Marjorie from Chester Abbey once wrote in her journal, "I know the fire may burn me, but last night I shivered so badly I wished for death. Better to burn in flame than turn to stone in frost." The words are chillingly honest, not a metaphor, but a real choice for people who lived in an age without safe heaters, without electric blankets, without any hope but fire. In fact, among some noble families, dying by fire was even considered elegant. If someone died in bed, smoke rising softly, body still whole, they were said to be embraced by the flame. Some monks even held prayers for such souls, believing that the fire purified their sins before leaving this world. In certain regions, candles were lit every winter not only to honor the dead, but to ask forgiveness from the fire itself. The danger didn't come only from braziers or charcoal, but from the castles themselves. Those mighty stone fortresses, built to withstand armies, were filled inside with flammable things, wool tapestries, velvet drapes, straw bedding, wooden beams. When fire caught, smoke got trapped in narrow halls, spreading fast. In 1408, Coucy Castle in France burned to the ground in a single night after a servant knocked over a brazier while cleaning. 42 people died, including 2 of the Lord's children. The tale spread across Europe, the curse of the flame. After that, many castles began to build safe fire alcoves, small stone niches where braziers could burn away from beds and curtains. But no matter how they adapted, human nature never changed. When night fell, everyone dragged the brazier closer to their feet, or pulled a blanket over it knowing full well they were flirting with death. Modern archaeologists have found haunting evidence. Charred copper pots, warped by heat, lying beneath the remains of wooden bed frames. In some cases, they found human bones blackened with soot, hands still clutching blankets, proof that they died, reaching for one last bit of warmth. No one knows their names, but their stories were written in ash, in smoke, in the hardened black dust that survived the centuries. Medieval people lived between 2 fears, the fear of cold and the fear of fire. But if they had to choose, they always chose fire, because in that endless winter, death by cold was slower and far lonelier. After countless nights of smoke and the burnt scent of animal hide, medieval people began to seek a gentler kind of warmth. Warmth with fragrance. Amid rooms filled with the smells of smoke, sheep, fat, and damp stone, they discovered that with just a pinch of leaves, a dried orange peel, or a sprig of rosemary, the fire became kinder, and sleep came easier. That was how the perfume of fire was born. By the 13th century, Europeans had learned to toss herbs, dried flowers, and oils into their braziers or fireplaces to mask the smell of smoke and hide. The French called it feu parfumé, the perfumed fire. In England, monks called it holy smoke. Different names, same meaning. Fire was not only for warmth, but for cleansing the spirit. In castles, servants prepared a special mixture known as a herbal sachet. It contained dried lavender, orange peel, thyme, cloves, and a bit of rosemary, all crushed and wrapped in thin linen. When the master prepared for bed, the servant would toss the sachet into the brazier or place it atop glowing coals. Instantly, the smoke changed from the harsh sting of charcoal to the soft, woody sweetness of gardens and forests. The room transformed into a spring greenhouse in the heart of winter. Every class had its own recipe. Nobles preferred lavender and dried orange for the scent of sunlight and distant southern lands. Monks used rosemary and frankincense, the familiar aroma of churches, to remind themselves of spiritual cleansing. The poor burned onion skins, wild mint, or cypress leaves, humble ingredients, but enough to mask the reek of smoke. Many believed lavender and rosemary had powers to ward off evil and disease. In monasteries during outbreaks, nuns burned rosemary around the sick, convinced the fragrance would drive away the devil's breath. Even physicians, called leeches, carried pouches of herbs to sniff while treating patients, to avoid breathing in corrupted air. But in castles, herbs carried a different meaning. They soothed loneliness. In the diary of Lady Blanche de Castile, she wrote, "I miss home. I miss the scent of orange blossoms. So I toss orange peel into the fire and hear it crackle like the wind of summer. Just a little scent, yet it brought the memory of warmth back into a cold room." And so, across Europe, people would say, "He who burns the right scent has already conquered half the winter." But scent itself had its own ritual. Servants were not allowed to choose the fragrance on their own, for each scent symbolized a feeling. Lavender for peaceful sleep, rosemary for loyalty, clove for passion, dried orange for happiness at home, bay leaf for victory and courage. On special nights, when the master returned from battle, or during Christmas Eve, servants mixed a memory smoke, a pinch of each, wishing for a year filled with strength, love, and peace. Over time, this became a nightly ceremony. After the servant cleaned the room, snuffed the candles, and drew the curtains, they would kneel beside the brazier, add the sachet, and whisper, "May warmth and fragrance keep you from cold dreams." Then they would leave quietly, as soft light and scent lingered in the air. Beyond its spiritual meaning, herbal smoke also had practical use. It purified the air and kept insects away. Modern archaeologists have found traces of essential oils in ancient castle ashes, proof of herbs burned in fires. Lavender and mint drove off fleas and lice, those nightly enemies of medieval beds. The perfumed fire, then, not only brought calm but spared people from itching through the night. Some said that winter nights felt less cruel when there was scent in the air. While snow fell outside and the wind moaned through the shutters, the fragrance of orange and herbs inside made it feel as though spring still lingered nearby. Fire no longer just warmed the body with scent, it warmed the memory. Today, if you've ever lit a scented candle on a cold night, you're doing exactly what the medieval people once did, calling fragrance home to keep the fire alive. In the freezing chambers of medieval castles, where stone walls exhaled cold like ice and wind hissed through every crack, people invented a small miracle of warmth: the curtained bed. It might look like mere decoration, but that four-post bed draped in heavy fabric was, in truth, a miniature castle within the castle, a private fortress, where people hid away to preserve a little human warmth through the brutal winter. The medieval bed was not just a place to sleep. It was the heart of the room, a symbol of status and a tool for survival. Made of oak or chestnut, it stood nearly a meter off the floor, supported by 4 tall posts that held up a wooden canopy. Around it hung thick curtains of wool, velvet, or double-woven silk. At night, servants would draw them tight, leaving only a small slit for air. Inside, the confined space filled quickly with breath and body heat, turning the bed into the only warm oasis inside a frozen fortress. Many described stepping into it as stepping into another world. Outside, the wind howled down the chimney, the walls groaned, torches flickered. Inside, the heavy curtains closed, sounds faded, leaving only breath and heartbeat. A single candle glowed against red velvet or green wool, not bright, but enough to make the sleeper feel hidden beneath the earth, safe, enclosed, protected. The curtained bed was also the perfect shield against drafts. In old castles, windows were narrow slits without glass, sometimes covered with animal hide or oiled cloth. Wind crept in from everywhere, especially at night, so even with a fireplace burning, the warmth vanished quickly. The bed curtains trapped it, keeping the air inside several degrees warmer. Records say the temperature difference between inside and outside the curtains could reach 10 degrees. One noble once joked, "The castle belongs to me, but inside this bed, I am truly king." The line was half humour, half confession, proof of how much humans depended on 4 fragile sheets of fabric to survive the world of stone and cold. Beyond warmth, the curtained bed had social and spiritual meaning. In an age when privacy hardly existed, servants walked in and out freely, families slept in shared halls, the curtained bed was the only private space one could claim. When the drapes closed, it meant, "No one enters." Servants waited outside, whispering, "My lord, is the fire warm enough?" Within that small enclosure, secrets were told, prayers whispered, dreams hidden behind velvet walls thick as fortress stone. Many rituals were tied to the bed. When a lord or king died, the curtains were drawn shut, and a candle placed inside a sign that the soul rests within its fortress. When a couple married, they were led to the curtained bed, and servants tied the 4 corners, closed, a symbol of protection and new beginnings. The curtains themselves were works of art. In grand castles they were embroidered with dragons, fleur-de-lis, or family crests. The wealthy commissioned Flanders weavers to make double-weave fabrics, 2 layers of interlaced wool, both warm and moisture-resistant. When guests visited, the bed was the centerpiece of the room. Servants proudly drew the curtains open to display it, much like showing off a painting today. In some French castles, curtained beds were even listed in wills, not for their material worth, but their meaning, the place where I lived, loved, and slept. A worn, the frayed curtain might be passed down for generations, kept as a relic, for it has witnessed the breath of our ancestors. But the most beautiful moment came at night. Servants snuffed the torches, leaving only one small candle. The master climbed into bed and drew the curtains shut. Outside, the wind still howled. Snow still fell, but inside was a world of warmth, privacy, and peace. They heard the distant crackle of fire, felt the heat swirl beneath wool blankets, and for a brief moment could forget the stone walls and raging storm. In the deep darkness of history, the curtain bed became the final symbol of human warmth. Warmth made of fabric, of breath, and of the illusion that mankind could defy winter. And in truth, they succeeded at least within that small kingdom of four curtains, a realm of comfort made only for sleep. When night fell and every door in the castle slowly closed, another world began to stir the world of the servants. If by day they stood silently behind their masters, pouring wine, opening doors, setting tables, then by night they became the keepers of warmth. For the nobility to sleep in comfort and fragrance, the servants endured a long, meticulous chain of labour, almost like a nightly ritual. The first step was washing and airing the linens. In castles, the air was always damp and cold, causing sheets, blankets, and curtains to smell of mould and smoke. So each afternoon, while there was still a little light, servants stripped the beds and carried everything near the great hearth or into the courtyard, hanging the fabrics on ropes or over stone rails to dry. They had no perfumed soap, only hot water mixed with lye and herbs. Lavender, rosemary, and mint were added as natural disinfectants. The servants scrubbed every seam, shook the cloth hard to release straw and feathers, then folded it neatly and placed it by the fire to dry completely. A single damp sheet could turn the bed into an ice cellar, so they checked every corner by touch. The second step was making the bed. It sounded simple, but bed-making in the Middle Ages was an art. Servants had to layer straw, padding, and blankets in precise order to fight the cold. First came the bottom layer dry straw or stuffing for insulation from the stone floor. Then a hide, usually deer or sheep, placed with the fur facing outward to trap heat. On top of that lay a thick fabric mattress stuffed with feathers, beaten evenly by hand. Finally, linen sheets were spread and tucked in with a royal triangle fold, ensuring that when the master slipped in, the covers sealed tight around the body, letting in no draught. Experienced servants could tell by sight whether a bed was ready for rest. If the blanket puffed up in the middle, cold air was trapped inside, they pressed it flat. If the linen wrinkled, it would chill the back. If the mattress sagged, it would strain the neck. Every detail was checked as if preparing a throne for sleep. The third step was scenting and pest-proofing. Inside castles, the smell of leather, smoke, and dampness built up day after day. Servants hung small sachets of dried herbs around the bed. Lavender, thyme, cloves, mint. They sprinkled powdered orange peel beneath the mattress to drive away fleas, the tiny monsters hiding in feathers. In wealthier castles, they wiped the bed frame and curtains with cloth soaked in wine or rose vinegar, disinfecting while leaving a pleasant scent. The task demanded both strength and finesse. Too much wine and the fabric stayed wet. Burn incense too long and the smoke clung to the blankets, making the master cough. The fourth step was warming the bed, the most crucial and dangerous part. Servants brought a small brazier or heated stones wrapped in wool and slipped them under the covers a few minutes before the master arrived. They had to time it perfectly too long, and the bed might burn, too short, and it stayed cold. A skilled servant could judge by touch, pressing a hand lightly to the fabric, sensing the perfect warmth, then removing the brazier and pulling the blankets tight. Afterward, they often knelt beside the bed, adjusting the curtains, sealing every gap where wind might creep in. When all was ready, the servant would bow and whisper the familiar words. "The bed is warm, the fire burns, and God will keep you in peaceful sleep." Then they would step back, moving as softly as a shadow. But the night's work was not over. The servant slept in a small room nearby, ears always alert. If the fire dimmed, they rose to stoke it. If the master coughed, they entered, added wood, opened the curtains, checked for breath. Servants were never allowed to sleep deeply. Their rest began only after their master's rest was certain. Some said, A servant's job is to sleep in his master's place. It sounded bitter, but it was true. They bore the cold, the fatigue, the long nights so someone else could sleep in warmth. In the medieval world, where class divided people as sharply as stone walls, the nightly ritual of preparing a bed was a mirror of society itself. Those below bowed and shivered by the fire, while those above dreamed between velvet and perfume. Yet they shared one thing: fear of the cold. And that fear bound them together. The servant needed work, and the master needed warmth. In the medieval world filled with hoofbeats, brass horns, and commands, privacy was almost a luxury. Castles, vast as they were, offered few places truly quiet. Hallways echoed with servants' footsteps. Great halls rang with laughter and talk from guards and guests, and even the private chambers of nobles were rarely private. In that world, the curtained bed, warm, enclosed, wrapped in layers of thick fabric, became the only space where a person could belong solely to themselves. By day, every action of the nobility was on display: how they ate, how they spoke, even how they dressed, always assisted by others. But at night, when the bed curtains were drawn, every gaze stayed outside. Inside were only their breath and heartbeat. Many described that moment as a small ritual, leaving the world behind to enter one's own. Countess Eleanor de Bohun once wrote in a letter to her sister, "Only when I draw the curtains close do I become myself. No longer a lady, no longer a mother, only a woman who wants to listen to the wind." The words seemed simple, but for someone living in a castle, they were a rare confession of freedom. The curtained bed was not just a fortress against cold, it was a fortress against the world. Behind those drapes, nobles could read love letters, cry, write in journals, or even speak to God things they could never do among others. Some kept mementos, tiny statues, or secret scrolls hidden under the mattress or between blankets. The bed, in many ways, became a safe of the soul. In 14th century England, records show that many noble women never allowed servants to enter the curtained space while they were inside. Servants could open the drapes only when summoned, and even then had to keep their distance. To them, another person stepping into that space was a violation of their inner territory. Even during grand feasts, when guests stayed overnight, everyone followed an unspoken rule. When the curtains close, the world stops. No one, not even a host, could open another's bed curtains. Even if there was only silence and warmth within, those curtains marked the boundary between public and private. Interestingly, within that small enclosed space, many of history's great decisions were made. King Edward II of England once ordered the execution of a counsellor after conferring with the Queen behind his bed curtains. In France, Queen Isabeau hid diplomatic letters inside a perfumed sachet hanging from her bed frame to avoid the eyes of courtiers. The bed, with its closed drapes, became a meeting chamber, a refuge, a confessional, a vault for secrets, and the one place where even power had to pause. Yet within that space also existed a peace no throne could provide. When all noise had faded and the wind softened beyond the shutters, the person within the curtains felt time slow down. Candlelight filtered through the fabric in a dim molten glow. They could hear distant crackling fire, the faint sigh of wind against stone, and sometimes their own heartbeat, a sound unnoticed in daylight. In that moment, noble rulers, valiant knights, elegant ladies, all became simply humans seeking sleep. No orders, no titles, only breath dissolving into darkness. A monk once wrote, "The rich have velvet beds, the poor have straw mats, but when they sleep, both share one wish, to rest." That line may have been truer than ever in the world of stone and cold. Peace did not come from gold, but from 4 curtains and a full night's rest. And that was the strange beauty of the Middle Ages. While the poor sought warmth from fire, the rich sought it from solitude. The curtained bed did more than hold heat. It held the distance between a person and the world, the space they needed to remain themselves. In castles of the 13th to 15th centuries, nearly every noble family kept at least one small dog, not for hunting or guarding, but to sleep beside them. It may sound strange now, but in those days, letting a dog share your bed was perfectly normal, even a symbol of affection and status. Dogs slept with people not only out of love, but for warmth. Their bodies were hot, their breathing steady, their fur thick when curled at the foot of the bed, They were like a living ember that breathed. In many written records, servants were instructed, "Do not drive the lady's dog from her bed, for it keeps her feet from freezing." Noble women often travelled with their small dogs, calling them bed dogs or comfort hounds. They were breeds like spaniels, bichons, or terriers, small, easy to carry, easy to sleep with, and especially good at staying curled up quietly through the night. A letter from Countess Margaret de Bohun to her husband in 1372 reads, "Last night was bitter cold, and only little Fleur kept my feet warm. Without her, I fear I would have turned to stone." In those few words lies the image of thousands of frozen nights with wind howling beyond stone walls, and inside the covers, just one person and one small dog trembling together. That bond was more than convenience. Dogs were seen as symbols of loyalty and unconditional love. When kings or nobles died, their dogs were sometimes mentioned in their wills, along with instructions for their care. In France, in 1420, Countess Anne de Beaujeu wrote in her testament, "Let little Ninette sleep beside me on my final night." And they truly did. The dog was placed next to her coffin, a companion beyond death. In medieval paintings, you can often spot this touching detail. A lady in velvet lying in her curtained bed, a small dog curled at her feet, or a knight removing his armour by the fire, as his dog jumps naturally into his lap. Artists called these scenes moments of humanity, where even the highborn beneath their crowns and armour sought a simple warmth shared by all. Not just nobles, but monks and peasants followed this habit too. Monks in the cold monasteries of Scotland often kept small dogs to sleep beside them. In the Journal of Brother Aidan, one line reads, "We call them the fires of God, for wherever they lie, the cold departs." In the countryside, larger dogs, hounds, or shepherds slept beside their masters in straw huts. They gave not only warmth but safety, since any strange sound in the night would make them bark. Perhaps because of that, many poor families survived thieves and wolves. Among nobles, though, letting a dog sleep on the bed carried deeper meaning, affection and power combined. Dogs ate from silver dishes, bathed in rose water, and had personal attendants. They were given their own space on the bed, resting their heads on feather pillows, even wearing wool cloaks embroidered with their names. And if a dog died, its owner might wear a small mourning band and light candles for the little friend who took the warmth away. A record from Westminster Castle tells that King Henry VIII slept with 3 dogs, each with its own blanket. Servants had to warm the dog's bedding before the king retired. In that frozen world, the dog became the purest symbol of warmth. No coals, no firewood, only its breath and soft body. And above all, dogs never cared about class. They slept beside whoever loved them, warming whoever needed them. Sometimes, when you look at an old painting of a noble asleep under a wool blanket, with a little dog curled at their feet, you suddenly understand. In a world of stone, cold, and survival, true warmth came from a creature that knew loyalty. A small dog, curled like a flame that never dies, a flame that breathes, that loves, and that stays. For medieval people, sleep was not just rest. It was a ritual, a journey away from the living world, and so, each night, they prepared for it as if preparing for a passage. In an age when medicine was vague and death could come at any moment from a chill, a plague, or simply a long winter's night's sleep was sacred. When the hearth fire had steadied, when the servants withdrew and the doors were shut, the master began the familiar ritual. The first step was prayer. Medieval people believed that during sleep, the soul left the body and wandered through the world of dreams. So they prayed for God or the saints to guard them from demons, sickness, and evil dreams, messengers of hell. The usual prayer went, "While I sleep, may you keep my heart, so that at dawn I still breathe in the light." The prayer, slow and low, echoed through a candle-lit room, giving the air a holy, sombre weight. To them, every night was a small trial between life and death. After the prayer came the final candle. A candle was more than light, it symbolized the soul. They believed that when it went out, the sleeper's soul was sheltered in blessed darkness. Many nobles lit 2 candles, one for the body, one for the soul. If by morning only one remained burning, they took it as a sign that God had visited them in their dreams. The poor had simpler ways. They drew a cross on their chest or window, praying for peace and as a charm against the cold. Children were lulled to sleep with a mother's whisper. "Sleep, my child, the angels guard you. Let no cold demon touch your feet." In monasteries the ritual was strict. Before sleep, the Compline bell rang the day's final prayer. Monks sang hymns in the dark, their voices mingling, rising through the stone corridors. Then the torches were put out, leaving only one candle on the altar. One by one, they walked back to their cells, footsteps faint on the cold floor, each closing the door and sinking into their own silence. An English monk wrote in 1329, "Each night I sleep as one dead, and each morning I rise as if born again." The phrase spread among nobles, becoming the era's philosophy of sleep. Slumber was practice for death, but also a chance for rebirth at dawn. Beyond prayer came the good-night blessing, an essential part of the ritual. In noble homes, before bed, a servant or family member would say, "May God keep you through this night." The one being blessed replied, "And may he keep your heart warm." The words were gentle, but in that time when cold and illness lurked in every shadow, they carried a deeper meaning, a wish to survive until morning. In the countryside, common folk said, "Sleep in the fire, wake in the Sunday." It wasn't just a wish for warmth, but a hope to see daylight again. For noble women, preparing for sleep came with its own spiritual ritual. Before lying down, they gazed into a bronze mirror, whispered a small prayer, and removed their jewelry. Taking off rings, necklaces, and hairpins wasn't just for comfort. It was an act of shedding vanity before entering the world of dreams. Because in sleep, everyone was equal. Even a queen had to lie down like a peasant. In some regions, people believed dreams were divine messages. Thus, preparing for sleep was like preparing to meet God. Dreaming of light meant blessing, of snow, loneliness, of fire, rebirth. So they didn't fall asleep carelessly. Each dream was treated like a prophecy. Some nobles even recorded their dreams each morning and sent them to priests for interpretation. Certain dreams made them change plans, delay battles, or grant pardons. Sleep, therefore, was not mere rest. It was a bridge between man and God. And when all the rituals ended, candles out, curtains drawn, only breath remaining, medieval people sank into sleep in silence, believing, "If God wills it, I shall wake." That simple phrase was the prayer of an entire age, a time when to sleep was to surrender to fate, and to wake was nothing short of a miracle. As the last light of dusk faded and wind began to whistle through the narrow cracks of stone walls, while the nobles were still dining or listening to music in the great hall, upstairs a group of servants had already begun. The silent ritual they repeated through hundreds of winter nights, preparing their master's sleep. This was no ordinary chore, but a carefully arranged process, almost a sacred ceremony, where every warmth and every scent had to be in its perfect place at the perfect time. The first task was spreading straw. Over the cold stone floor, servants laid a layer of golden dry straw, thick enough to absorb moisture and soften footsteps. Straw wasn't just padding. It carried the pleasant scent of fields, a hint of warmth and nature, a touch of summer preserved inside the cruelty of winter. The torchlight flickering across the straw made the room glow softly, as if covered by a natural golden carpet. Next came the herbs. From a small brass flask, the servants sprayed a mixture of rose water, peppermint oil, and lavender. The moisture filled the air, blending with the scent of smoke and wool, softening the atmosphere. Herbs weren't just for fragrance. They were believed to chase away sickness and evil spirits. The scent was a silent prayer to God, asking that the room remain safe through the night. After that, they placed the hot stones. Fist-sized rocks, heated red in the kitchen fire, were quickly taken out, wrapped in wool cloth, and slipped under the mattress at the bed's foot or along its sides. The stones released steady warmth for hours, slow and even. On freezing nights below zero, they could mean the difference between peaceful sleep and death by cold. Servants had to be swift, wait too long, and the stones cooled, wrap them poorly, and the cloth burned, place them wrong, and the master might be scalded. One mistake could cost them their position or worse. When the bed was warm, they adjusted the curtains to block drafts, cleaned the hearth, replaced the ashes with fresh logs, and stoked the fire until it burned bright. The fire wasn't just for heat, it was proof that the house was still alive. In its flickering light, the servants' shadows stretched across the walls, as if they were the silent souls of the castle itself. Finally, when all was ready, they set a small brazier beneath the table or near the bed to hold the heat until the master arrived. Some added a tiny linen sachet on the pillow, filled with dried lavender, rosemary, and frankincense. When the head touched the pillow, the fragrance would spread, easing the sleeper into rest. Then they withdrew, stepping softly, their movements as light as breath. Before leaving, each servant bowed and whispered, "May God keep you warm." It was not a polite phrase, but a genuine prayer because they knew better than anyone that one cold night could mean death. For them, keeping their master warm was keeping the household alive. After the master retired, the servants didn't leave completely. They stayed nearby, in a small chamber off the hall, listening for every sound. If the fire weakened, they returned to add logs. If the wind howled too loud, they checked the windows. They lived in the space between darkness and duty, not allowed to sleep, not allowed to rest silently, ensuring the warmth never died. The old servants called their work keeping the night. They joked that they were friends of the dark, because only when night fell did their true labour begin. And though no one praised them, they repeated every careful motion with quiet devotion because they knew a steady flame meant their master was still safe. On some nights, a servant would sit silently before the hearth, watching the embers fade, thinking to themselves, "When the fire dies, I'll relight it. When morning comes, I will sleep." Another night passed like 1,000 before in the rustle of straw and the faint perfume of herbs. Cold was not just a natural phenomenon, it was a measure of power. Whoever could keep warm, ruled. Whoever shivered, obeyed. In the chill that crept through stone walls, social hierarchy became sharper than ever. From the one lying beneath velvet and feather quilts to the one crouched by the hearth, separated by only a few meters but divided like two worlds. In that picture, the servants were the beings on the border, close enough to feel the warmth of power, but never allowed to touch it. They could stand right beside their master's fire, yet not warm their hands. They could change the blankets, place the hot stones, yet never sit down. And one small mistake, a weak flame, a stone that cooled too soon, a curtain left slightly open, could spark a fury in the middle of the night. In the diary of Thomas, a servant at Arundel Castle, he wrote, "On the 14th night of December, the fire died too early. The Earl woke, shivering, and threw the blankets to the floor. I was summoned at midnight, forced to kneel in the cold until dawn. A simple mistake, forgetting to add wood, became a sin. For nobles, cold was unacceptable. It was not merely discomfort, it was an insult to their status. Among the frozen stone walls, every servant had to learn how to read warmth. They needed no thermometer, a touch of air near the bed, the crackle of wood, the feel of a draft was enough to tell when to add coal, when to shift the curtains. The inexperienced ones blundered, making the fire too high so smoke filled the room, or placing the brazier too close and letting the fabric soak up soot. But the seasoned ones could keep a room warm all night without staying awake. In many households, they earned nicknames like the Firekeeper, the Watcher of Warmth, and were sometimes respected almost like priests. Yet one mistake could ruin everything. A certain noblewoman was said to be so temperamental she counted the sparks in her hearth. If the fire burned too low, she accused her servants of stealing her warmth. The story spread across the region as a warning. Never let your master feel the cold, they see it as betrayal. But not every outburst was born of cruelty. The winters of medieval Europe were unlike the cold we know. It sliced through skin, froze muscles, and made the body tremble no matter how many layers were worn. When a noble woke in the night with stiff limbs and smoky breath, they felt fear, a primal fear that no wealth could drive away. And in that panic, they called for their servants, unleashing anger upon the nearest soul. Because in the darkness and the cold, anger was the only way to feel alive, to feel powerful. The servants understood. They didn't argue or protest, only bowed their heads and whispered, "Forgive me, my lord." Then they quietly added wood, straightened blankets, picked up spilled wine. Inside them, the cold reached to the bone not just from the air, but from the distance between human and human. Some old servants, who had spent their lives in this duty, had seen every kind of master, the harsh, the gentle, the lonely. They said that the midnight outbursts were really just muffled cries. The earl who shouted from cold was really afraid of solitude. The lady who threw her pillows was really longing for home. Winter made people fragile, and the servants were the only witnesses to that fragility. In a letter from a maid named Agnes to her sister, she wrote, "Last night, my lady wept from the cold. I didn't know what to do, so I added more coal and said, 'The night will soon pass.' She held my hand and said, 'If only you could sleep here.' But I wasn't allowed." Those trembling lines reveal a sad truth. Between stone walls and ranks, warmth was never shared equally. Servants feared the cold, feared punishment, but what they feared most was letting their master freeze. For if the master fell ill or died of the chill, the blame was theirs. In some castles, servants were ordered to sleep near their lord's door to absorb the draught, meaning that when the wind seeped through, they took it first. Some even froze to death in those corridors, found at dawn stiff as stone while inside the room, the fire still burned, and the noble slept in peace. If you think medieval knights, after a glorious day of clashing swords on the battlefield, returned to their castles to rest alone, on luxurious featherbeds, you're mistaken. In truth, many knights never slept alone, not because they were lonely, but because it was cold. The cold in 13th, 14th century Europe was so brutal that sleeping alone could mean death. Inside those stone castles with walls several feet thick, the temperature could drop close to freezing even indoors. Wind slipped through every crack, and the floors were so cold that moisture froze upon them. Even with wool blankets, furs, and a fireplace, the warmth wasn't enough to keep a body alive through the night. So knights, squires, and sometimes even brothers shared beds to keep from freezing. The large beds in shared chambers often fit 2, 3, even 4 people. They slept close, wrapped under one blanket, back to back. It wasn't intimacy, it was survival. One man kept the fire, 2 kept the heat, and everyone lived. In the household book of Sir John Howard, England, 15th century, there's an entry that reads, "My lord and 2 guards slept together in the great bed on a frosty night. The fire was weak, but they were warm by each other." Such lines appeared so often that to people of that time, sharing a bed carried no shame at all. The practice was even more common during military campaigns. When knights travelled with few tents, they slept 3 or 4 to a single animal hide. Many journals mention that the man on the outside suffered the most, as the cold pierced through fur and stiffened their limbs. The one in the middle, however, was lucky, wrapped in the warmth of the others. An old soldier once said, "I slept between 2 comrades for 10 winters. Without them, I'd not be here to tell it." A simple sentence, but it carried the harsh truth of the age. Warmth often came from having no other choice. In large castles, a knight's chamber was usually near the stables or kitchens, where it was slightly warmer. But even there, shared sleeping was common. Some shared a bed with a brother, others with a trusted servant. Many strange bonds were born from those nights between master and servant, between comrades in arms, between 2 people who would never dare speak honestly in daylight. Because when darkness fell, when wind howled through the shutters, and 2 men shivered under the same blanket, the boundaries of power began to fade. In those moments, they were no longer knight and squire, just 2 beings trying to survive the night. In some parts of Europe, sharing a bed was even seen as a sign of trust. In England and France, there was a custom called the bedfellow oath, a pledge between 2 comrades made while they shared a bed. If one betrayed the other, forgiveness was denied even beyond death. The historian Froissart wrote of 2 French knights, Raoul de Gail and Henri de Gienne, who swore brotherhood on a freezing night by sharing a blanket and vowing to live or die together. That story became a symbol of medieval brotherhood. Yet not everyone took to it easily. Some young nobles, newly knighted, thought it humiliating to share a bed. But after a few nights of shivering, they learned that pride doesn't keep you warm. A northern proverb from that time put it simply, "In winter, the fool is the one who sleeps alone." And indeed, those stubborn ones often fell ill within weeks. It's fascinating in paintings and chronicles. Medieval knights are always portrayed as strong, stoic, made of steel. But when night fell within those cold stone walls, They became fragile, needing another's warmth like anyone else. One servant once said, "By day, they kill men. By night, they fear the wind." It sounds ironic, but its true bravery doesn't melt the frost. And perhaps it was on those nights, when 2 or 3 shared a blanket, listening to the same wind and trembling together, that a bond was forged deeper than any victory or medal could create. They didn't speak much. They just felt the warmth, the breath, the presence of another life. In the frozen dark, it was their way of saying, "I am still alive." When archaeologists excavated old castles, they were surprised to find beds so large that 4 people could fit. At first, they thought it was a symbol of luxury, but after study, they understood. It was a symbol of survival. If knights shared beds because of the cold, then among the common folk, communal beds were almost essential in winter. In wooden houses, straw huts, or servant quarters inside castles, a bed wasn't for one person, it was for the whole family. Imagine a small room with a low ceiling, smoke drifting just under the roof. In the centre, a rough wooden bed with a straw mattress, a worn wool blanket, and 3 or 4 bodies pressed close together. Father, mother, children, even a servant or a traveller passing by. In the night's chill, they curled together like warm stones, back to back, legs tangled, their breathing blended into one, a faint rhythm between life and sleep. The poor had no feathers or bear pelts, so they used each other as blankets. Children were tucked between their parents, the elderly lay closest to the wall to avoid drafts. Sometimes, a small dog slept at the foot of the bed, a breathing fireplace, raising the room's temperature by a few degrees. The smells of smoke, wool, dry grass, and human warmth mixed together, messy but familiar. In some parts of Europe, the communal bed was even seen as a symbol of solidarity. People called it the bed of life. A record from Brittany noted, "When frost covered the roofs, villagers went to each other's homes and shared beds through the night. No one was ashamed, for everyone knew it was the only way to survive." Even in great castles, servants lived the same way. 3 or 4 of them slept together on a long bed, sharing one thick wool blanket. They laughed, talked, teased before falling asleep, then drifted into dreams as the fire cracked softly in the hearth. Warmth didn't come from the flames, but from the person beside you. Some said, the communal bed is where people learn to trust. Because when you sleep beside someone in the cold, there's no room for pretense, only real breathing, and the faith that the other person is keeping you warm too. To modern minds, the idea of sleeping in one bed with 3 other people might seem strange, but to the medieval world, it was survival. In the endless winter, with wind howling outside the walls and frost clinging to the roof, the communal bed was humanity's small fortress against a frozen world. Communal beds might have been warm, but they weren't always peaceful. When the night grew long and the blankets too few, a quiet war broke out over who got the middle. The one in the centre was always the warmest, while those on the edges shivered. There was a folk joke that said, "The one on the outside needs no morning bell, for the cold will wake him first." In servant quarters, arguments over blankets were common. One pulled the cover, another kicked, someone stuck a foot out and yelped from the cold, scrambling back into the middle. Some nights, one would sit up and shout, "You've stolen all my warmth!" And the whole room would burst out laughing, forgetting the cold for a moment. Those small bursts of laughter made winter a little less cruel, because in the wind and darkness, a shared laugh under one blanket was worth more than any fire. In the dark, bodies pressed together, breaths mixing. They didn't think of love, only warmth. It was the intimacy of those cornered by winter. People might be strangers, not even know each other's names, but lying side by side, those boundaries disappeared. In monasteries, monks slept in long rows, hands tucked into sleeves, shoulders touching. They called it the warmth of faith. On the battlefield, soldiers lay shoulder to shoulder, half awake, half dreaming, knowing that if one left, the other might freeze to death. Winter taught people that warmth was the only language that needed no words. There was no romance, only heartbeat and survival, but that was what brought them closer than love ever could. Before winter arrived, castle servants had a special duty: perfuming the floor. The stone floors were cold and damp, so they spread a layer of straw and dried grass mixed with fragrant herbs, lavender, rosemary, mint, As they walked, the scent filled the room, covering the smell of smoke and moisture. They called it the perfume of stone. Beneath their feet, the straw felt soft and warm, like the earth itself was sleeping under snow. In monasteries, monks believed that scent warded off evil spirits, so they added resin and holy incense. When night fell, the rustle of straw underfoot blended with the crackle of fire, sound and scent, weaving together a curtain of warmth that made people forget the bitter wind outside. As winter dragged on and white covered the world, everything seemed frozen in silence. Yet inside the castle, the scent of herbs lingered, the smell of memory and hope. Lavender recalled summer fields, mint the scent of green forests, rosemary the taste of sunlight. Medieval people believed that fragrances had souls, and when they drifted through the air, they reminded them that nature wasn't dead, only asleep. One servant whispered, "As long as there is scent, there is life." Amid snow and ice, they clung to those small fragrances not for beauty, but to believe that spring would return. In the shadows of the hearth, the fragrance became an invisible promise. No matter how cold, the world would bloom again. The night inside a castle was never truly silent. When the fire died and darkness crept in, the sounds began. Wind moaned through the cracks like ghosts whispering. Chains on doors creaked. Dogs barked from the courtyard. Wood in the ceiling groaned as it tightened in the frost. Medieval people were used to those noises. They called it the music of stone. Some were frightened, thinking they were spirits, but the old ones said, "It's the castle breathing." And indeed, every sound, no matter how small, proved the place was still alive, still fighting the winter. Under the blankets, people listened, sometimes counting the gusts of wind like heartbeats. And in that quiet, among 100 distant sounds, they drifted into sleep, lulled by the breath of the castle itself. A medieval winter was not just a season, it was a test of the human heart. Amid snow and frost, fire, fur, and blankets were only temporary. What truly kept people alive was each other's warmth. From king to peasant, from knight to servant, all shivered before the same cold, all sought the same comfort, a hand, a breath, another's presence. Stone walls couldn't block the wind, but hearts close together could drive the winter away. When dawn broke over the thick snow, and smoke rose from every house and castle, it wasn't just a sign of life. It was proof that humanity had conquered the cold, not with strength, but with kindness and warmth. And so, in that frozen world, they still found spring in each other.